She heard him say it. 4 words. Her husband's voice, cutting clean through the smoke and the screaming and the weight of a collapsed ceiling pressing her ribs flat. Save Celeste first. Not his wife's name, not Vivian. 20 years of standing beside that man, covering his sins, bleeding quietly so his empire could breathe. And when the building came down around them both, she was the one he left. If you've ever loved someone who chose another person in the moment that mattered most, you already know what died inside Vivian Romano that night. Stay until the very end. And if this story hits you somewhere real, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The gala had been Vivian's idea originally, 3 years ago when the Romano name still needed a coat of respectability painted over its darker bones. She had been the one to suggest the charity angle, a fundraiser for pediatric burn units across the state, something that would get cameras in the room and keep the right politicians smiling in the right photographs. She had organized the venue, approved the catering, selected the floral arrangements herself, stood in 4-inch heels for 6 hours across 3 separate site walkthroughs until the ballroom of the Alderton Grand felt like something she could be proud of. It was her event, her vision. Her name on the program beneath Damien's, printed in smaller letters the way everything in her life had always been printed. Present, but secondary. Visible, but never quite the point. The night of the gala, Vivian wore midnight blue. She had considered black, but Damien's stylist, a woman she had never entirely trusted, suggested midnight blue would photograph better under the ballroom's chandelier light, and for once Vivian agreed without argument because she was tired, and because the dress was genuinely beautiful, and because she had learned, somewhere in the long middle years of her marriage, to choose her battles with the precision of someone who only had so many left. She wore her mother's pearls. She smiled at every person Damien needed her to smile at. She shook hands and remembered children's names and asked about vacations and illnesses and graduations with the ease of a woman who had spent 2 decades perfecting the performance of a life that fit perfectly from the outside. Damien arrived 40 minutes late. He always arrived late to these things. It was a power move so habitual it had become invisible to him, the way powerful men's worst habits always eventually become invisible to themselves. He came through the main entrance with 4 of his security detail flanking him and Celeste Vaughn on his arm. Vivian saw it from across the room, the way his hand sat at the small of Celeste's back, the way Celeste tilted her head when she laughed at something he said, that practiced sideways tilt that Vivian had watched her perform at 6 separate events over the past 14 months, each time a little more comfortable, a little more possessive, the tilt of a woman who had stopped pretending she was just a business associate and had not yet decided how much she cared who noticed. Celeste was 31 years old. She had come into the Romano organization as a financial consultant 18 months ago, recommended by one of Damien's captains, a man named Gio Ferrante, who Vivian had never liked, and had said so exactly once before Damien told her she was being paranoid, and she had filed the moment away and said nothing more. Celeste was beautiful in the specific way that made other women feel the air go out of the room. Not classically. Her features were sharp, almost angular, and she moved with the contained energy of someone who was always calculating something just behind the surface of her expression. She wore red. Of course she did. Vivian watched Damien steer her toward the main table with his hand still at her back, and she picked up her champagne glass and finished it in 2 swallows and set it down on a passing server's tray without looking, and kept her face arranged into something serene. They did not speak until dinner. Damien found his seat beside Vivian and kissed her cheek and smelled like a cologne she didn't recognize, which told her everything. "You look good," he said, which was not the same as saying she looked beautiful, and they both knew it, and neither of them said anything about the difference. "The room looks wonderful," said the mayor's wife, seated to Vivian's left, and Vivian thanked her and meant it because the room did look wonderful, and that was hers. That was something she had made, and she held on to it the way you hold on to something small and warm when the larger things are going cold. The explosion happened at 9:47. Vivian knew afterward, from the federal investigators who would spend the next 4 months picking through the wreckage, that the device had been planted beneath the northeast corner of the ballroom floor, beneath the service corridor that ran under the raised dining platform where the host table sat. She did not know any of that in the moment. In the moment, there was only a sound that was not quite sound so much as a physical fact, a pressure that rewrote the air. And then the chandelier above the host table lurched sideways on its chain, and the floor cracked open, and Vivian was thrown backward into the architectural column behind her chair, and something heavy and concrete and final came down across her left shoulder and her chest, and the world went the particular gray that is not unconsciousness, but is the closest thing to it that a person can experience and remain technically present. She could hear screaming. She could hear the fire suppression system engaging somewhere above her, a mechanical hiss beneath the human noise. She could feel blood, warm and specific, coming from somewhere above her left ear. And she could feel the concrete pressing her down, and she could not move her left arm at all, and she was trying to breathe, and each breath was a negotiation, a small argument between her lungs and the weight on her chest about how much space she was allowed. And then she heard his voice. Damien, on his security radio. She recognized the channel's static, the particular frequency his team used. The sound of it had been the background noise of 20 years of her life. His voice was controlled in the way it always was when he was frightened, which meant it was flatter than usual, stripped of everything except function. Status, he said. And then, half a breath later, before anyone had answered, Where is Celeste? Get Celeste out first. Save Celeste first. Vivian lay under the concrete and the smoke and the silence that existed underneath all the noise, and she heard those words with a clarity that had nothing to do with volume. The words didn't echo. They landed once, clean and permanent, the way a key fits a lock. Not violently, not dramatically, just with the quiet precision of something finding the place it was always meant to go. And in that precise moment, something inside Vivian Romano that had been bending for years under the weight of loyalty and patience and the specific faith a woman places in a man she built her life beside. That thing stopped bending. It didn't break. It just stopped. Became something else, something that did not feel pain the way it had 30 seconds ago. She was still conscious when Damien's security team found her. Two of them, Marcus, whom she had known for 9 years, and a younger man whose name she couldn't place, lifted the concrete slab with a hydraulic tool brought in from the emergency kit in the service elevator. Marcus said her name when he saw her face. He said it twice, with the particular quality of a man who is frightened but is not allowed to show it in his voice. Mrs. Romano, Vivian, can you hear me? She told him yes. She told him she could hear him fine. She asked him how bad the shoulder was, and he told her it wasn't too bad, which meant it was bad, which was fine because she had already assessed it herself and reached approximately the same conclusion. They got her onto a stretcher. She kept her eyes open the entire time. Through the smoke and the emergency lighting that had kicked on, harsh, white, unforgiving, she could see the room coming apart around its edges, tables overturned, flowers scattered across wreckage, a woman's shoe, red-soled and expensive, sitting upright in the middle of a field of broken glass as though it had been carefully placed there. Vivian noted all of it with the detached thoroughness of a woman who had just reorganized her understanding of her own life and was now cataloging the world with new eyes. She saw Damien across the room. He was standing with Celeste. His arm was around her, both of them unhurt as far as Vivian could see, and Celeste had her face pressed against Damien's jacket, and his hand was in her hair, and he was speaking quietly into the top of her head, and he had not yet looked toward the stretcher where his wife was being carried out through the emergency exit. Vivian looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then she looked away. She did not look back. The hospital they brought her to was St. Catherine's, 12 minutes from the Alderton Grand. The emergency team worked on her shoulder, fractured in 2 places, the collarbone cracked, and treated the laceration above her ear, and ran a scan for internal bleeding that came back clean, and gave her something for the pain that she refused twice before accepting on the 3rd offer because the shoulder had moved from negotiable to non-negotiable, and she had never seen any point in suffering more than was strictly necessary. She was practical that way. She had always been practical that way, and Damien had loved that about her once, or said he had, which she now understood were not necessarily the same thing. Damien came to the hospital at 11:30. He came in with 2 of his men flanking him and his jacket torn at the shoulder seam and his face carrying the particular expression she had learned to read as his public grief face. Present, visible, performing an emotion in the direction of the correct person while the actual interior of him remained elsewhere. He sat beside her bed and took her hand, the right one because the left was immobilized, and said, "Thank God you're all right." And then he said, "It was a structural failure. The city's people are saying it was old pipe conduit under the floor, gas buildup, something the venue should have caught in an inspection." He said this quickly, like a man filling silence before questions could grow in it. Vivian looked at him. "Is that what they're saying?" she said. "That's what it looks like right now." "Mm." She moved her eyes back to the ceiling. "And Celeste, she's all right." A pause. Brief, maybe half a second, but she had been reading his pauses for 20 years, and this one was the pause of a man recalibrating. "She's shaken up. She's fine. It was a bad night for everyone." "It was," Vivian agreed. He stayed for 40 minutes. He made 3 phone calls from her room, turning slightly away from her each time as though the partial rotation of his body constituted privacy. She listened to all 3. The first was to his consigliere, a man named Paul Dietz, about the venue's insurance liability and what the Romano family's public statement would be. The second was to someone she didn't recognize discussing a name, Vargas, repeated twice, in a context she couldn't fully parse. The third was brief, maybe 90 seconds, and he dropped his voice for it below what she could distinguish, and when he finished he put the phone in his jacket pocket and came back to the chair beside her bed and said he had to go. That there was a lot to manage tonight, that she should rest. "Of course," she said. He kissed her forehead. His lips were dry. "I'll check in the morning." "I know you will," she said. He left. She listened to his footsteps go down the corridor, and she lay in the antiseptic white of the hospital room, with the pain medication making the edges of things softer than they deserved to be, and she thought, with great clarity, about what came next. She was discharged 36 hours later. The attending physician wanted her to stay an additional day given the shoulder fractures and the concussion. Mild, he said, but still a concussion. And she thanked him and told him she was going home. He gave her a look that said he was not comfortable with this decision, and she gave him a look that said she understood his discomfort and had noted it and was going home regardless, and they reached an arrangement. She signed the paperwork herself. She called her own car, not Damien's driver, her own. A woman named Theodora, who had been driving Vivian to private appointments for 6 years, and who asked no questions and remembered nothing she overheard and was paid exceptionally well for both qualities. She did not go to the Romano family's main residence in Westfield. She went to the apartment she had maintained quietly for 11 years under a name that was technically her maternal grandmother's, an arrangement she had put in place during a period of marital difficulty a decade ago that had resolved on the surface but had never quite resolved underneath it, and which she had never entirely dismantled because she was, as previously established, a practical woman. The apartment was clean and undisturbed. It smelled like cedar and a candle she kept on the kitchen counter that no one else knew about. She sat down at the kitchen table with her arm in the sling the hospital had given her, and she let out a long, controlled breath, and she looked at the wall, and she thought. She thought for a long time. What she thought about was not Damien. Not yet. She thought about the explosion first, because the explosion was where the practical thinking had to begin. She was not a woman who accepted coincidence easily. 20 years beside a man who moved in the world Damien moved in had cured her of that particular naivety early and permanently. The Romano family hosted 4 public events a year. They vetted every venue. Damien's security team did a full sweep of any location he was scheduled to appear in minimum 12 hours before arrival, with a secondary sweep on the day of. The idea that a structural gas failure would slip through that process was not impossible. It was simply very unlikely. It was the kind of unlikely that had a different explanation underneath it if you were willing to follow the thread. She thought about Celeste Vaughn. She thought about the timeline. 18 months in the organization, recommended by Gio Ferrante, brought in as a financial consultant, which meant she had access to the family's accounts, to the flow of money in and out of the legitimate holdings that served as the public face of the Romano operation. Vivian had spent the first 8 years of her marriage managing those legitimate holdings herself, before Damien had gradually, so gradually she had barely tracked it happening, moved her out of active management and into the purely ceremonial role she occupied now. At the time, she had told herself it was because the businesses had grown too complex, that Damien trusted specialists, that it wasn't about her. She had believed this, or chosen to believe it, which in her experience amounted to the same functional outcome. Now she thought about it differently. She thought about the captains whose faces had changed over the past year and a half. Men she had known, men who had been loyal to the Romano name since before Damien inherited it from his father. Luca Bertone, who had managed the Eastern distribution network for 16 years, quietly sidelined 6 months ago in favor of a younger man Celeste had recommended. Frank Morrow, who had served as the family's liaison to 3 separate city council offices, and who had retired abruptly in January with a payout that struck Vivian, when she heard the number, as simultaneously generous and suspiciously expedient. Even Paul Dietz, the consigliere, who had known Damien since childhood, Vivian had noticed that Paul no longer sat at the primary table during family meetings, that his advice was solicited less and agreed with less, and that his voice had taken on the particular careful quality of a man who was still in the room but was no longer certain he was safe in it. One by one, patient and unhurried, the way you clear a board. Vivian sat at her kitchen table and she thought about all of this, and her shoulder hurt, and the concussion made the light in the room feel slightly wrong, slightly too bright at the edges, and she sat with all of it and let it assemble itself into a shape she could look at clearly. Then she picked up her phone, the private one, not the one registered to Damien's family plan, and she called a number she had not called in 4 years. The man who answered was named Bernard Couot. He was 63 years old, and he was a forensic accountant who had spent 22 years working for the federal government before retiring and setting up a private practice that served, selectively and expensively, clients who needed to understand exactly where money had gone and who had moved it and what trail it had left behind. Vivian had used him once before, during the marital difficulty a decade ago, and she had paid him in cash, and he had delivered a complete picture of a set of financial movements that had subsequently convinced Damien, when Vivian laid the documentation in front of him across the kitchen table in Westfield, to resolve the situation in the manner she had requested. Bernard Couot was not a man who asked what his clients intended to do with the information he provided. He was a man who provided the information completely and accurately and sent his invoice and moved on. "Mrs. Romano," he said after she identified herself. He had a voice like gravel that had been worn smooth by a long-running river, rough in texture, measured in pace. "It's been a while." "It has," she said. "I need you to look at something for me." "What kind of something?" "Financial records. Romano family holdings, the legitimate ones. 18 months, going back from present. I'm looking for irregularities. Outflows that don't match stated purposes. Accounts that have been restructured without board documentation. Anything that looks like it's been moved somewhere it shouldn't be." A short silence. Not the silence of reluctance. Bernard Couot was not a reluctant man. The silence of a man who was making a quick professional assessment. "You have access to the records?" "I have access to everything I need," she said. Which was true. Damien had moved her out of active management, but he had never revoked her documentation access. One of those oversights that happen when a powerful man becomes confident enough in his situation that he stops paying attention to the perimeter. She had continued to file away her access credentials each time the system updated them, quietly, without drawing attention to it, the way she did many things. "Timeline?" Bernard asked. "I want a preliminary picture in 10 days. Another brief silence. "That's aggressive." "I know. Can you do it?" "I can do it," he said. "Same arrangement as last time?" "Same arrangement." She hung up. She sat for another moment in the kitchen with the light coming in crooked through the blinds, the way light did when you had a mild concussion and the world was slightly refusing to sit flat. Then she opened her laptop, the private one, kept in a case under the apartment's bedroom floorboards. Another old habit she had never been able to bring herself to abandon. And she began pulling the financial documents she had access to and organizing them into a structure Bernard Couot would be able to work through efficiently. Her shoulder hurt badly enough that she had to stop twice to breathe through it. She stopped, breathed, continued. The work had a quality that pain did not penetrate the way it penetrated ordinary activity. This was not ordinary activity. This was the beginning of something she did not yet have a full name for, but whose shape she was starting to understand, whose edges she could feel the way you feel the edges of a room you're standing in before the lights come on. She worked until 2 in the morning. Then she took the medication she'd been avoiding, set an alarm, and slept in the apartment's small bedroom with the door locked and the window cracked 2 inches for air. She did not dream. Or if she did not remember. Damien called the next morning at 8:15. She answered on the 3rd ring. She had learned long ago that answering immediately conveyed eagerness, and not answering at all conveyed hostility, and she was not prepared to convey either. "How are you feeling?" he said. "Better," she said. "The shoulder is sore but manageable." "Good. Good. Listen, I want to set you up at the house, get Elena in to help with the—" "I'm at a friend's," she said. "I'm comfortable here. I don't want to be managed right now, Damien. I just want to rest." A beat. "Which friend?" "Monica Sewell." Monica Sewell was a woman Vivian had known since college who lived in Connecticut and who would, if called, cover this story without hesitation or elaboration because she was that kind of friend. The rare kind. The kind you keep through 2 decades of marriage to a man who fills the room and tends to make people's other relationships feel smaller by contrast. "She came and picked me up this morning. I'm going to stay here a few days." "Monica Sewell," Damien repeated. His voice said he wasn't fully satisfied, but couldn't articulate why without revealing that he'd been hoping to place her somewhere observable. Okay, if that's what you need, I'll call you tonight." "You don't need to," she said. "I know you have a lot to manage." "Vivian, I mean it. I'm fine. Rest and time, that's all. Don't worry about me." She could hear something shifting in his silence, the specific discomfort of a man who has been given exactly what he wanted, which was not to have to worry about the wife, and who has found, now that it's been handed to him cleanly, that it sits slightly wrong. "I'll call tonight," he said again firmly, like a man reasserting his own authority. "All right," she said. She spent the next 4 days in the apartment. She sent Damien brief, calm text messages in response to his calls. She was resting, the shoulder was improving, she was being looked after, she'd be home soon. She said all of it in the tone she had spent 20 years mastering, warm enough to satisfy, unspecific enough to leave no verifiable detail. Meanwhile, she worked. She worked through Bernard Couot's first preliminary report, delivered electronically to a secure address on day 4, and she sat with the numbers he had flagged, and she felt the shape of what she was looking at come into focus with a specificity that was not satisfying exactly, but clarifying. The way a diagnosis is clarifying. You didn't want it to be what it was, but there was a cleanness to knowing. Celeste Vaughn had been moving money, not crudely, not in a way that would be obvious to anyone running a routine audit, not in a way that would have triggered any of the internal compliance controls that the Romano organization's legitimate holdings were required to maintain. It was sophisticated work. Money moved through subsidiary accounts to holding companies in 3 separate jurisdictions, shifted through what appeared to be legitimate consulting fees and vendor contracts, and facility management charges paid to companies that existed on paper and nowhere else. Bernard's preliminary estimate was that somewhere between $4 and $8 million had been redirected over the prior 14 months, a number that was significant in absolute terms, but was calibrated carefully against the Romano family's total legitimate revenue to fall just below the threshold that would draw automatic scrutiny. It was the work of someone who knew exactly how the monitoring worked. Someone who had been inside the organization's finances long enough to understand not just where the money was, but where the gaps in visibility were. Someone who had access and patience and a long enough timeline to be thorough. Vivian read the report twice. Then she called Bernard, and they talked through the methodology for 30 minutes. And he told her what he needed next to complete the picture, and she told him she would get it to him, and they hung up. She sat back in her chair, and she thought about Gio Ferrante, who had brought Celeste in. She thought about the captains who had been moved. She thought about the explosion and the device beneath the floor and the question of who would have had access to the venue's service corridors and the operational knowledge to plant something there that would pass a standard security sweep. She thought about Damien standing across the burning ballroom with his hand in Celeste's hair. She thought, how long have you been building this? Not the affair. That was old, and she had made her peace with what peace was available to her regarding it. She thought, how long have you been building a replacement? How long have you been looking at me and seeing something you've already decided to leave behind? The thought was painful. She did not try to make it less painful. She let it be exactly as painful as it was, sat with the full weight of it, because she had learned, not easily, not quickly, but learned, that trying to manage pain before you've actually felt it only made it bigger over time. You had to feel it first. You had to let it be real. She felt it. Then she set it down and went back to work. On the 5th day, she called Monica Sewell, the actual Monica Sewell, in Connecticut, and asked if she could stay for a few days, and Monica said yes immediately and without a single unnecessary question, because that was the quality that made Monica worth knowing across 20 years and 2 very different lives. Vivian drove there in her own car and sat in Monica's kitchen and drank coffee and let herself be in a room where no one was performing anything for anyone, which was a rarer experience than it should have been in a life like hers. She told Monica most of it, not the financial specifics, not Bernard's report, not what she was building toward, but the explosion and the radio and those 4 words and what they meant, what they really meant, stripped of every excuse she could have made for Damien if she had chosen to keep making them. Monica listened without interrupting. When Vivian finished, Monica was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "What do you need? Not what happened, or how are you feeling, or are you sure you heard it right? Just what do you need?" "I need time," Vivian said. "I need to not be findable in a certain way for a little while longer, and I need you to tell anyone who asks that I've been here." "Done," Monica said. She poured more coffee. "And after the time, what then?" Vivian wrapped both hands around her mug, carefully, her left shoulder still limiting the range of motion on that side, and she thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Then I go back," she said, "but not the same way I left." Monica nodded once. She understood the kind of woman Vivian was. She had understood it since they were 22 years old, and she had watched Vivian navigate the world with a quality that other people sometimes mistook for passivity, but was actually something much more disciplined, the quality of someone who knew that the most powerful move available to her was frequently the one that looked like she wasn't moving at all. "Okay," Monica said. "Stay as long as you need." Vivian stayed 3 more days. She slept better than she had in months, which told her something about her body's relationship to the life she'd been living that she filed away alongside the other information she'd been accumulating about her own situation. She spoke to Damien by phone each evening, brief conversations, warm and unspecific. She told him the rest was helping. She told him she missed the house. She told him she'd be home by the weekend. She spent 2 of those 3 days in Monica's guest room working through documents on her laptop, and the 3rd day she drove to a meeting she had arranged through a contact she had kept carefully separated from every other part of her life, a woman named Adria Santos, who had been a lawyer for the Romano family for 11 years, before she resigned abruptly 2 years ago under circumstances that had been explained to Vivian at the time as a mutual parting, and which Vivian now, with the benefit of revised understanding, suspected were something else entirely. Adria Santos now ran a small private practice out of an office above a dry cleaner in a part of the city that had nothing to do with the Romano family's geography. They met at a coffee shop 3 blocks from Adria's office. Adria was 44 years old, compact and precise in the way that very organized minds tend to make themselves visible in the body, with close-cut hair and the particular watchfulness of someone who had spent years in a room with dangerous people and had learned to make the watchfulness look like ordinary alertness. She was already at the table when Vivian arrived, and she stood to greet her and looked at the sling on Vivian's left arm and said, "I heard about the gala. I'm glad you're walking." "So am I," Vivian said. They sat. They ordered. They waited until the server had moved away and the surrounding tables were occupied by people who were clearly having their own conversations before either of them said anything that mattered. "Why did you leave the family's legal team?" Vivian said. Not a question. A prompt. Adria looked at her steadily. Why are you asking me that now? Because I think I know the answer, Vivian said, and I want to know if I'm right. A pause. Adria picked up her coffee. Put it down. Celeste Vaughn, she said. Tell me. So Adria told her. It took 23 minutes, and Vivian listened to all of it without interrupting. The pressure she'd felt to authorize financial movements she couldn't ethically sign off on. The documents that had been altered after her review. The sense of being systematically crowded out of the loop on decisions she should have been central to. And finally the conversation with Gio Ferrante, in which he had made clear, with a politeness so pointed it might as well have been a threat, that her continued comfort in her role depended on her continued flexibility. She had resigned the next morning. She had taken nothing with her that she wasn't entitled to take. She had told herself she was done with that world, and she had mostly believed it. But you kept copies, Vivian said. A longer pause this time. That's a significant thing to say out loud. I know it is. Adria looked at her, looked at the table, looked back. If I had kept copies of certain documents, she said slowly, they would be in a location that required a significant legal framework around them before they could be used in any way. And there would need to be a clear picture of what they were being used for. And that picture would need to make very clear what protections existed for the person who had kept them. I understand all of that, Vivian said. I'm working on building that picture. I'm not asking you to do anything yet. I'm asking you to know that I'm building it, and to be willing to have a second conversation when the picture is complete. Adria was quiet for a long time. The coffee shop moved around them, a couple arguing softly near the window, the hiss of the espresso machine, someone's phone ringing and being quickly silenced. He doesn't know you're here, Adria said. No. He doesn't know what you're doing. No. He thinks you're recovering at a friend's house in Connecticut. Yes. Adria picked up her coffee again, and this time she drank from it. When she set it down, her expression had settled into something that was not quite a decision but was adjacent to one, the look of a person who has been waiting, without fully knowing they were waiting, for a particular kind of offer to arrive. Have the second conversation, she said, when you're ready. Vivian drove back to Monica's house in the early afternoon with the windows down and the late autumn air coming in cold and clean, and she thought about what she had, what she needed, and what came next. She had Bernard Cuo assembling the financial picture. She had Adria Santos and whatever she had kept from her time inside the family's legal operations. She had her own access to the documentary records of 2 decades of involvement in an organization that had depended on her, instrumentally and completely, even as it had been systematically undervaluing her for years. She thought about the other people Damien had sidelined. Luca Bertone, Frank Morrow, Paul Dietz, still technically present but functionally diminished. Men who had served the Romano name with the specific loyalty that comes not from fear but from genuine alignment. Men who had built their professional lives around a family and a code, and who had found themselves quietly made redundant by a process they had not fully understood because it had been executed with patience and precision and the cooperation of a man who should have been protecting them. She thought about what those men might know, what they might still have access to, what they might be willing to do if someone came to them with a clear account of what had been done and a credible path towards something other than the slow erosion of everything they'd built. She thought, you thought I was finished. She thought, you thought I was going to cry and grieve and eventually accept, and that would be the end of it. She turned onto the highway heading north toward Monica's house, and the winter light was flat and pale across the fields to either side of the road, and her shoulder ached with the specific insistence of bones that were healing but were not yet healed, and she thought, with a clarity that had arrived sometime in the past 6 days and had not left. That was your mistake. Not the other woman, not even the radio. The mistake was thinking that what you saw when you looked at me was all there was. She would go home at the weekend, as she had promised. She would walk back into the Westfield house, and she would be exactly what Damien expected her to be. Present, composed, a woman in recovery, a wife returning to her life. She would give him nothing that indicated she had moved so much as a single piece on the board. She was going to need him comfortable. She was going to need him looking in every direction except the one she was actually moving. She had time, she had documents, She had people who had been wronged and who were waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for someone to show them what doing something about it might look like. She had the memory of her husband's voice on a security radio, choosing someone else while she lay bleeding under rubble, and she had made that memory into something harder and more useful than grief. She was not broken. She was not even close to broken. And on the morning she finally walked back into the Westfield house, smiled across the kitchen at her husband, and told him it was good to be home. She saw something flicker in Damian Romano's face, something that arrived and departed in under a second, something she had never seen there before in 20 years, something that looked briefly and inexplicably like unease, like the instinct of a man whose body knows something his mind has not yet processed. She filed it away, smiled again, set her bag down and asked if there was coffee. The next phase of her life had already begun, and he had no idea. The coffee was good. Damian made it himself, which he only did when he was trying to demonstrate something: domesticity, normalcy, the performance of a husband who was present and attentive. And Vivian accepted the mug with both hands and said thank you, and meant neither the gratitude nor the dismissal of it. She stood at the kitchen counter of the Westfield house and looked out through the tall windows at the back garden, which had gone brown and skeletal in the weeks she'd been away, and she drank the coffee and let the silence between them be comfortable, because comfortable silence was what he needed from her right now. And she had learned in the past 11 days to think about what he needed with the cold strategic clarity of someone who was no longer operating from the same set of motivations she'd had before. The Aldertons' lawyers called, Damian said. He was leaning against the opposite counter with his own mug, watching her with the expression she recognized as his version of attentive, present, visually focused, but the mind behind it doing something else entirely. They want a statement from you. The city inspector's report is calling it a gas conduit failure, like I said. I heard, she said. Paul mentioned it. A small pause. You talked to Paul. He called to check on me while I was at Monica's. He was concerned. She turned from the window. He's always been considerate that way. Damian's jaw moved slightly. Not quite a clench, more the subtle muscular adjustment of a man who has registered something he wasn't expecting and is deciding how to file it. Paul's been a little out of the loop lately. He's dealing with some personal things. Is he? Vivian said. She made her voice curious and nothing more. I didn't know that. He seemed fine on the phone. He's fine. Everything's fine. Damian set his mug down. I'll have Marcus drive you to the Aldertons' legal offices whenever you're ready. Shouldn't take more than an hour, just your account of what you remember from the night. Standard stuff. Of course, she said. Whatever they need. She gave the statement 3 days later. She told the Aldertons' lawyers exactly what she remembered from the night of the gala in the precise, measured language of a woman who had sustained a concussion and was being careful not to overstate her recollections. The noise, the fall, the weight of the structural material, the emergency team's response. She said nothing about the radio transmission. She said nothing about what she had heard her husband say. She answered every question she was asked and volunteered nothing that had not been asked. And when it was over, the lead attorney shook her hand and told her she had been very helpful, and she thanked him and went home. She had been back in the Westfield house for 9 days when Bernard Couot delivered his complete report. She read it in the apartment, having driven there on the pretense of picking up some personal items she'd left during her stay. The report was 47 pages. She read all 47 with a pot of tea going cold on the table beside her and the winter light failing outside. And when she finished, she sat back and looked at the ceiling and took 3 slow breaths. Celeste Vaughn had not taken $4 to $8 million. She had taken 11.3. The preliminary estimate had been conservative because the methodology and the final layers of the scheme was more sophisticated than the early-stage movements Bernard had assessed first. Shell companies within shell companies, vendor contracts that cycled through 3 separate jurisdictions before landing in accounts that were technically registered to entities with no visible connection to Celeste personally, but which Bernard had traced through ownership structures that were, when you followed them far enough back, connected to a single trust established in Celeste's mother's name in a state with favorable privacy statutes 18 months ago, 2 weeks after Celeste joined the Romano organization. 2 weeks after. She had been planning this before she walked through the door. The second section of the report addressed the captain transitions. Bernard had reconstructed the financial circumstances around Luca Bertoni's departure and found something that had not been visible on the surface. Luca had not been simply sidelined. He had been made to look incompetent. Specific transactions in the Eastern distribution network had been altered after the fact. Small discrepancies introduced into the record that, if surfaced in an audit, would have pointed directly at mismanagement in Luca's division. They had not been surfaced in an audit. They had been allowed to sit there, dormant as insurance, as leverage. A man who has falsified records in his division, even if the falsification was done to him rather than by him, is a man who cannot easily come forward about anything. The same pattern appeared around Frank Morrow, around two other mid-level family members whose quiet exits Vivian had noted but not yet connected. A pattern of manufactured vulnerability, carefully seeded into the record, designed to keep people quiet after they were moved out and to prevent them from coordinating against whoever had moved them. Vivian thought about this for a long time. She thought about what it meant for the conversations she intended to have with Luca, with Frank, eventually with Paul Dietz if the moment arose. If these men believed they were carrying compromised records in their history, they would be afraid. Fear was a powerful silencer. Whoever had constructed this system had understood that fear was more durable than loyalty and had bet accordingly. She thought, unless someone shows them the construction, unless someone can prove to them that what they're afraid of was manufactured. She photographed every page of Bernard's report with her private phone. She sent the photographs to an encrypted storage address. She returned the physical report to Bernard with instructions to maintain his own secure copy and to be available for testimony if that became necessary, a contingency she framed as unlikely but prudent. Bernard said he understood and billed her, and she paid him, and that was the end of that conversation. She drove home to Westfield in the early dark and made dinner and ate it across the table from her husband and listened to him talk about a zoning dispute involving one of the family's legitimate real estate holdings. And she asked questions where questions were appropriate and refilled his wine without being asked. And when he looked at her across the table, she met his eyes and gave him the specific warmth she had been giving him for 11 days. Present, recovering, grateful to be home, no angles visible. He relaxed into it the way men relax into comfort when they believe they have produced it themselves. His shoulders dropped slightly. He poured his own second glass. He told a story about Paul Dietz being difficult in a meeting that afternoon, and Vivian laughed at the right moment and said Paul was impossible when he felt left out of things, and Damien agreed with a comfort that told her he had not heard the slight edge she'd put into it, or had heard it and taken it as spousal solidarity rather than information. After dinner, he took a call from Celeste. He took it in his office with the door closed, which he had stopped bothering to do 3 months into the affair, but had apparently resumed now that Vivian was back in the house and theoretically recovering, and therefore theoretically more fragile, and therefore theoretically in need of protection from the obvious. She washed the dinner dishes and listened to the muffled rhythm of his voice through the office door set. Not the words, just the cadence, which shifted register when he was talking to Celeste in a way she had trained herself not to hear until recently and could now not unhear. She dried the last glass and put it away and went upstairs. The meeting with Luca Bertone happened on a Thursday, 11 days after she came home. She had arranged it through a mutual contact, a woman named Deb Castillo who had worked adjacent to both the Romano family and the independent operators in the Eastern network for years and who owed Vivian a favor from an incident 3 years ago that Vivian had handled quietly and well. Deb set up the meeting as a lunch between herself and Luca at a restaurant in the west end of the city, and Vivian arrived 20 minutes late and sat down at the table and watched Luca's face go through 3 distinct expressions in under 2 seconds: recognition, wariness, and then the careful professional neutral of a man who has survived in complicated circumstances by learning to not show his hand. "Mrs. Romano," he said. "Luca." She sat. She ordered water. She looked at him directly. "I'm not going to waste your time with small talk. I think you know why I'm here." His hands were flat on the table. He was 58 years old, built like a man who had once been larger and had compressed inward over time, with gray at his temples and the specific stillness of someone who made decisions by making as few visible movements as possible. "I'm not sure I do," he said carefully. I know what happened to your division records, she said. I know who altered them and when and why. I have documentation. She paused. You've been sitting with something for 6 months that you believe makes it impossible for you to say anything to anyone. I'm here to tell you that what you're carrying was put there. It's not yours. A long silence. Deb had become suddenly very interested in the menu. Luca looked at Vivian with the eyes of a man deciding whether what he was hearing was real or was a different kind of trap. That's a significant claim, he said. I have a forensic accountant's report, she said. 47 pages. I can get you the section relevant to your situation within 48 hours. She kept her voice even. I'm not asking you for anything right now. I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm asking you to know that someone has the full picture and that the person who built those records into your history is the same person who has been systematically dismantling the organization you spent 16 years serving. Luca was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than it had been. How much does Damien know? About the records? Nothing, as far as I can tell. She picked up her water glass. About the rest of it, I don't think he knows the full scope. I think he's been managed as carefully as everyone else. You think he's been played? I think someone very patient has been using his blind spots as a corridor, she said. And his biggest blind spot is that he stopped paying attention to the people who had been there longest. Something shifted in Luca's face. Not agreement exactly. It was too early for agreement. But the specific easing of a man who has been holding something heavy for months and has just been told he might be able to put it down. What are you building? He said. Something complete, she said. Something that doesn't leave loose ends. She met his eyes. When I'm ready to have the next conversation, I'll be in touch. For now, I just need you to know I exist and that I have what I have. She left before the food arrived. She drove to the east side and sat in a parking structure for 20 minutes, thinking about the meeting and what she had seen in Luca's face and what it meant for the geometry of what she was assembling. Then she drove home. The fight with Damien happened that evening. It had been building for days. She could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather. And it broke open over something small, the way these things almost always do. She had moved a folder from his home office desk to the side table in the hallway, a folder she hadn't opened or read, simply relocated because she was straightening the house and it had been sitting on top of 3 days of mail. He came in from a meeting and found it on the side table and stood in the hallway, holding it with a tension in his body that was disproportionate to a misplaced folder. I had things in a specific order, he said. I'm sorry, she said. Not sorry. I was cleaning up. I don't need you to clean up my office. I wasn't in your office. The folder was on the hallway desk. I put it there for a reason. She looked at him. Damien, it's a folder. It's my work, he said, and his voice had an edge now that was not about the folder, and they both knew it. I need to know where my things are. Your things are on the side table in the hallway, she said, exactly where I put them, which I just told you. He stared at her. She held the look without flinching. This was new. She could see him registering that it was new, could see the slight recalibration happening behind his eyes, the way you recalibrate when something that has always behaved predictably does something unexpected. She had not, in 20 years of marriage, held his stare during an argument without eventually softening it. He had counted on that softening. He had built whole rooms of his behavior on top of it. You seem different, he said. I had a ceiling fall on me, she said. People change after that kind of thing. He looked at her for another moment. Then he took the folder and went into his office and closed the door, and she went to the kitchen and stood at the counter and breathed carefully through her nose and let the adrenaline metabolize before she moved again. Her hands were steady. She was glad they were steady. She met Frank Morrow the following week. Frank was 61 and retired in the technical sense and spent most of his time at a house on the water in a suburb 40 minutes from the city. But his eyes, when she sat across from him in the small back room of a bar he partly owned, still had the quality of a man who was watching everything. He listened to what she told him with the specific attention of someone who has long suspected a version of the story they're being told and is now having the shape confirmed. When she finished, he said, Gio Ferrante. Gio Ferrante, she agreed. He always moved funny around the woman, Frank said. I said it to Damien 18 months ago. He told me I was getting old. I know. Frank rubbed his face with one large hand. What do you need from me? You dealt with 3 city council liaisons for 11 years, she said. You know which ones are clean and which ones aren't. I need to know which federal contacts you dealt with that were not connected to the family, people whose integrity wasn't compromised. He looked at her carefully. You're going to bring this to the feds. Not yet, she said. But I need to know who's clean when I do. He was quiet for a moment. He picked up his drink and set it down without drinking from it. There's an agent out of the field office downtown, he said. Name's Carver, Diane Carver. She ran an inquiry into the Romano books 3 years ago that went nowhere because the evidence she had access to had been cleaned before she got to it. She's not dirty. She's not been bought. She's also, he said, with the measured tone of a man choosing words with care, been looking for a reason to reopen that case ever since. Vivian noted the name. Thank you, Frank. Don't thank me, he said. Just make sure whatever you're building holds up when somebody pulls on it. It will, she said. She believed it. She drove home in the gray afternoon light with the heater running and the city moving past the windows, and she ran through the architecture of everything she had. Bernard's report, Adria Santos and her copies, Luca Bertoni's testimony about the falsified records, Frank Morrow's knowledge of the council liaisons, and his introduction of the name Diane Carver, and underneath all of it the 20 years of quiet observation she had made about the Romano organization's operations, its people, its pressure points, its genuine vulnerabilities. She was not a lawyer, and she was not a federal agent, and she was not a soldier, and she was not any of the things that the world Damien moved in recognized as powerful. She was a woman who had spent 2 decades in every room that mattered while being treated as furniture, and furniture sees everything. Damien signed the financial restructuring documents on a Friday afternoon. She found out because Paul Dietz called her, not Damien Paul, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man who is passing information while technically saying nothing that could be held against him. The restructuring consolidated operational authority over 3 of the Romano family's most significant legitimate business entities under a newly created executive role, the terms of which effectively transferred day-to-day decision-making power away from the family partnership structure and into the hands of whoever held the executive title. The executive title, in the restructuring documents, went to Celeste Vaughn. Vivian sat with the phone to her ear and Paul's careful, neutral voice describing the shape of it, and she felt something cold move through her that was not surprise. She had expected something like this, had been waiting for something like this, but was still, despite the expectation, its own kind of impact. The confirmation that what she suspected was real always landed differently than the suspicion had. Thank you, Paul, she said when he had finished. I wanted you to know, he said. I thought you should know. I know you did. She paused. How are you holding up? A brief silence from his end. I'm managing, he said, which meant he wasn't, which they both understood. There's a meeting next week with the family's outside accountants. I've been asked to present revised projections. The projections I've been given to present don't match the numbers I've seen in the actual books. She absorbed this. Paul, don't present them. Vivian, find a reason, get sick, have a conflict. Whatever you need to do, don't put your name on numbers that aren't real. Her voice was steady. I need you available later. I need you credible. If you present false projections, you become part of the paper trail we're trying to dismantle, you understand? Silence on his end again, longer. You're further along than I thought, he said finally. I'm exactly as far along as I need to be. She had dinner with Damien that night. He was in a good mood. The expansive, settled mood of a man who has just done something he's confident about, who has resolved something that had been requiring resolution. He opened a bottle from the cellar and poured it generously and talked about the year ahead, about growth in the real estate portfolio, about a development project in the western corridor that had been stalled and was finally moving. He talked about travel. Maybe they should go somewhere in the spring, somewhere warm. It had been too long since they'd taken time. He said this looking at her across the candlelit table with the wine in his glass and the fire going in the dining room hearth, and the expression of a man who has just transferred significant power to his mistress and is now sitting across from his wife feeling, perhaps, a complicated guilt that expresses itself as generosity. "That sounds nice," she said. "Somewhere warm." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. His hand was warm. She remembered when that warmth had meant something to her, and the memory of it sat alongside the present reality of it in a way that was not sentimental and was not painful anymore, was simply information, filed in the same careful place where she filed everything now. "I'm glad you're home," he said. "So am I," she said. 3 days later, Vivian drove to the south side of the city and walked into the office of a woman named Sylvie Park, who ran an accounting firm that had been working adjacently to the Romano family's books for years without ever being fully brought inside. One of those professional relationships that stayed technically arm's length by mutual arrangement, which meant Sylvie Park knew exactly what the books contained without being legally implicated in their contents. Sylvie was 49, meticulous, and deeply unhappy with the situation she had been navigating carefully for 3 years. She shook Vivian's hand and they sat in her small office with the door closed, and Vivian put a summary of Bernard Couot's report on the desk between them, and Sylvie read it and did not speak for a long time. "The restructuring documents Damien signed Friday," Vivian said. "They go through your firm for compliance certification." "They do," Sylvie said. Her voice was careful. "You haven't certified them yet. The certification isn't due until end of month." "I need you to hold it," Vivian said. "I need 30 more days." Sylvie looked up from the report. "That's a significant ask." "I know what it is." Vivian held her gaze. "I also know that certifying those documents makes your firm complicit in a financial structure built on embezzled funds, because that's what the restructuring is. The $11 million that moved through the Romano books over the past 14 months is embedded in those entities now. Your certification puts your name on it." Sylvie was very still. "You're sure of the $11 million? The forensic accountant who produced that report has 30 years of federal and private practice behind him. I'm sure." Another long silence. Outside Sylvie's office window, the city made its ordinary sounds. Traffic, a siren somewhere, the mundane noise of a world moving without any knowledge of what was being decided in this small room by two women who did not raise their voices. 30 days, Sylvie said. 30 days, Vivian confirmed. She was in the parking garage below Sylvie's building, her keys already in her hand when her phone rang. The number was one she didn't recognize, but the area code was local, and she answered it on instinct, the way you answer unknown local numbers when you're in the middle of something and can't afford to miss information. "Mrs. Romano," a woman's voice, controlled, professional, with the specific flatness of someone who had been trained to put nothing extra into their tone. "My name is Diane Carver. I'm a special agent with the Federal Field Office on Merchant Street. I was given your name by a mutual contact who I think you know." A brief pause. "I'd like to meet." Vivian stood in the concrete gray of the parking garage with the fluorescent lights humming above her and her heart doing something deliberate and forceful in her chest. That was not quite fear and was not quite elation and was something between them that had no comfortable name, and she thought, here it is. The moment where this stops being something she's building alone. She thought about the 30 days she'd just bought. She thought about Bernard's report and Adria's copies, and Luca and Frank and Paul Dietz being sick at the right moment, and Sylvie Park's certification sitting unsigned, and she thought about Damien's hand warm over hers at the dinner table 3 nights ago, and his voice saying, "I'm glad you're home." And she thought about 4 words spoken into a security radio while she lay under concrete, and she thought, you had everything, and you decided it wasn't enough, and you let someone into the house who has been taking it apart brick by brick while you weren't watching, and I have been watching, and I have been building, and I am not broken, and I am not gone, and it is time. "Agent Carver," she said, her voice steady as a table. "When and where?" Diane Carver met her at a diner on Merchant Street, 2 blocks from the Federal Field Office, at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday when the place was full of construction workers, and nobody was looking at anybody else with particular attention. Carver was already there when Vivian arrived. A woman in her mid-40s, lean in the way that suggested she hadn't prioritized eating regularly in years, with dark hair cut practically short and eyes that moved across the room in a sweep so habitual it had become invisible. The professional vigilance of someone who had spent too long in spaces where threat could come from any direction. She was drinking black coffee, and she had a folder on the table in front of her that she did not open when Vivian sat down. "Thank you for coming," Carver said. "Frank Morrow speaks well of you," Vivian said. "Frank Morrow is a careful man." Carver looked at her with the direct, assessing quality of someone who was building a first impression with professional speed. "He told me you were careful too." "I try to be." "He also told me you have documentation." Carver's hands were flat on the table, the kind that would reopen the inquiry we closed 3 years ago. "I have a forensic accountant's report covering 14 months of financial movement through the Romano family's legitimate holdings," Vivian said. $11.3 million redirected through a structure of shell companies and manufactured vendor contracts. "I have a former family attorney with physical copies of documents that were altered during her time with the organization. I have 2 former family associates whose employment records were retroactively falsified to prevent them from coming forward. And I have the name of the individual who built all of it." Carver did not move. Her expression did not change in any dramatic way, but something behind her eyes sharpened with the specific quality of a person who has been patient for a very long time and has just been handed a reason to stop being patient. "Celeste Vaughn," she said. It was not a question. Vivian held the steadiness of that. "You already had her name." "We had her adjacent to things we couldn't prove 3 years ago," Carver said. "She wasn't calling herself Vaughn then. She had a different professional identity, a different organizational affiliation. She was younger and she was less sophisticated, and the inquiry we ran closed because the records we needed had been cleaned before we got to them." She picked up her coffee. "She's been doing this for a long time, Mrs. Romano. The Romano family is not the first organization she's moved through." The diner moved around them, plates scraped. Someone laughed too loudly near the window. Vivian sat with what Carver had just said and felt it rearrange several things she thought she had understood. "How many?" she said. "That we can document partially. 3. The Romano organization is the most ambitious operation she's attempted. The others were smaller, faster. She learned from them." Carver set her cup down. "She's also not working alone. She never has. There's a structure underneath her. People who set up the shell companies, who manage the jurisdictional transfers, who handle the enforcement side when someone in an organization needs to be persuaded to cooperate or vacated from their position." A pause. "The gala bombing. That wasn't improvised." "I didn't think it was." Position. A pause. "The gala bombing. That wasn't improvised." "I didn't think it was. It was a professional job. The device was placed by someone who knew your husband's security protocols in specific detail. That means someone inside the Romano security apparatus was either turned or replaced at some point in the past year." Carver's eyes were steady on her. "We have a partial profile on the individual we believe placed the device. He's not local. He came in specifically for that job and left within 18 hours of the explosion." She paused. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "You're telling me Celeste intended to kill someone at the gala," Vivian said. "We believe the device was positioned to do maximum structural damage to the host table, where the Romano family principals were seated." Another pause, precise as a blade. "All of them." Vivian breathed in through her nose. She breathed out. She thought about the host table, where she had been sitting, where Damien had been sitting, where Paul Dietz had been 2 seats down, and the 2 family board members who occupied the other chairs. She thought about the device under the northeast corner, under the raised dining platform. She thought about how the structural collapse had gone, south and lateral, the way the investigators had described it. The main force of the blast pushing upward and outward from directly beneath the host table's center. She thought about who had not been at the host table, who had been on the floor, mingling, moving between tables during the cocktail hour that preceded dinner, and who had therefore been out of the blast zone when it went off. Celeste, who had been with Damien on the floor when the explosion happened, who had steered him, Vivian now understood with a clarity that was almost physical in its impact, away from his seat during the cocktail hour with whatever pretext she had used, A conversation, a person she needed him to meet, something that had kept him moving and kept him off the platform at 9:47. She didn't save him, Vivian said. Her voice was flat. She moved him. Yes, Carver said. She moved him away from the table. She knew exactly when it was going off. We believe so. And when the building came down, she made sure she was next to him, made sure he saw her as the person he needed to protect. Vivian stopped. Her hands were in her lap under the table, and she pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed. She was always going to remove him eventually. Once she had enough control transferred into structures she owned, she needed him useful and compliant until the transfer was complete, and then she needed him gone. That's our working assessment, Carver said quietly. The bombing was premature. Something accelerated the timeline. We don't know what. The device went off before the principals were fully seated, which is why the casualties were what they were rather than what they were intended to be. What were they intended to be? Carver looked at her for a moment. Damian Romano and his 3 senior board members. At minimum. Vivian sat with that. She sat with it the way you sit with something that cannot be unsit with, that has to be absorbed through the body because the mind moves too fast and too defensively to take the full weight of it directly. Her husband. Whatever she thought of Damian Romano, whatever he had done and chosen and failed at, she had not sat across dinner tables from him for 20 years and raised a life beside him to arrive at wanting him dead. The complexity of that sat in her chest like a stone, and she let it sit there because removing it wasn't the immediate task. I need 30 days, she said. Carver frowned. Mrs. Romano, 30 days, she said again. There's a compliance certification on the restructuring documents Damian signed that's being held. When those documents are certified, the money Celeste has been moving becomes structurally embedded in the Romano family's legitimate entities in a way that will take years to untangle in court. If we move before the certification is held, the financial evidence is cleaner, the forensic trail is clearer, you get a better case. Carver studied her. And what do you do with 30 days? I get you everything you need to make the case unlosable, Vivian said. The accountant's report, the former attorney's documents, testimony from 2 former family associates, and a clear reconstruction of the bomb plot that connects Celeste to the device through the security breach inside the Romano operation. She paused. I also need the 30 days to make sure the people around Damian who aren't compromised are protected when this comes down. Paul Dietz, a few others. They've been maneuvered into positions that look bad on paper. I need time to document that the positions were manufactured. You're negotiating, Carver said. Not accusatory. Almost fractionally impressed. I'm being practical, Vivian said. You've been trying to build this case for 3 years. 30 days gets you a case you can actually win. Is that a reasonable trade? Carver was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the folder on the table that she still had not opened. Then she looked back at Vivian. 28 days, she said. Then I need everything you have in a form my office can use. Done, Vivian said. She drove home from that meeting with the heat in the car too high and her coat still on because she hadn't thought to take it off, and the city sliding past the windows in the flat gray of a winter morning. She drove carefully because her hands wanted to grip the wheel too hard, and she was making a conscious choice to not do that. She thought about what Carver had told her about Celeste's prior operations. She thought about a woman who had done this before, who had moved through 3 organizations before this one, who had learned from each iteration and arrived at the Romano family more sophisticated and more patient and more thoroughly prepared than she had ever been before. She thought about the preparation that would have required, the discipline of it, the coldness. She thought, she and I have more in common than I would like. She parked in front of the Westfield house and sat in the car for 2 minutes with the engine off before she went in. Damian was at the kitchen table with his laptop and his 3rd cup of coffee of the morning and the expression he wore when he was moving pieces around in his head, slightly absent, slightly compressed around the eyes. He looked up when she came in. Early start, he said. I couldn't sleep, she said. I went for a drive. She poured herself coffee. How did the meeting with the accountants go yesterday? Fine. His attention went back to the laptop. Paul didn't make it, which was annoying. Said he had a stomach thing. Poor Paul, she said. He clicked something. Celeste covered the projections. She was sharp. Vivian looked at the back of her husband's head and thought about what Carver had said about the blast radius and the host table, and the seconds of difference between Damien being on the platform and Damien being on the floor. She thought about his hand in Celeste's hair in the burning ballroom. She thought about how thoroughly he had been managed, how completely, how patiently, how skillfully, by someone who had identified his vanity and his blind spots and his hunger for the particular kind of admiration that his wife had long since stopped performing and had fed him exactly what he needed to consume while she took apart everything around him. She thought about telling him. She considered it genuinely for the first time since the diner, not from sentiment, not from any residual attachment that wanted to protect him, though she was honest with herself that some residue of that existed and she was not going to pretend otherwise, but from pure strategic assessment. If Damien knew, what did he do? He was not a man who absorbed information and sat quietly with it. He was a man who acted, often before he had thought the action through, because his sense of his own authority required visible response. If he knew, he would confront Celeste. And if he confronted Celeste, Celeste would know that someone had told him, and the only person who could have told him was someone who had assembled enough information to be dangerous. She could not tell him. Not yet. Not for 28 days. She looked at the back of his head, and she said nothing, and she drank her coffee, and the morning moved forward. The first crack appeared 8 days later. It appeared not where she had been watching for it, but in a direction she had not fully covered, which was, she would think afterward, the thing about a plan built by one person. There are always angles you haven't watched because you only have two eyes, and there are only so many directions you can face at once. It was Gio Ferrante. She had known Gio was compromised. She had known since she first started pulling the thread that Gio had brought Celeste in, that Gio had been the mechanism of her entry into the Romano organization, that whatever arrangement existed between them was foundational to everything that had followed. What she had not fully calculated was that Gio had been watching the organization the same way Celeste had been watching it, with the patient, territorial awareness of someone who has a stake in what is happening and the instinct to identify threats before they become visible. He called her on a Wednesday afternoon on the Westfield House phone, the main line, the family number, not her private cell, and said he wanted to stop by, that he had some paperwork Damien had asked him to drop off. She said, of course, whenever was convenient. He arrived 45 minutes later, which told her the call had been a test. He had been watching to see whether she deflected or panicked or made an excuse, and she had done neither, which was correct. But his arrival time told her that he had been nearby when he called, which meant he had been watching the house. She met him at the door. He was 52 years old, heavy-set with the specific density of a man whose physical size had always been part of his professional toolkit, with a manner that was warm on the surface and calculating 3 layers below it. He handed her an envelope. Thin, the kind that contained 1 or 2 pages, not the kind that contained the kind of substantial paperwork a man drives 45 minutes to deliver. And he came inside when she stepped back to let him, and he stood in the front hallway and looked around the house with the eyes of a man assessing a space. "Damien's not here," she said. "I know," Gio said. "He texted me. It's fine, I just wanted to drop that off." He didn't move toward the door. "You look good, Vivian. After everything. You look strong." "I feel strong," she said. She held the envelope at her side. "Thank you for coming by, Gio. How's the shoulder?" "Healing." "Good." He looked at her with the particular quality of a man who is telling you he knows something without saying what he knows. "You've been busy," he said. "Since you got back. A lot of errands, meetings." Her heartbeat did not change. She kept her breathing even and her face arranged in the mild social expression it had been wearing since she opened the door. "I've been catching up," she said. "I let a lot of things slide while I was recovering." He nodded slowly. "I heard you had lunch with Deb Castillo a few weeks back." "Deb and I are old friends," she said. "Sure." He looked at the floor briefly, then back at her. "And Frank Morrow." Silence. 1 second, maybe 2. "Frank and I have known each other for 15 years, she said. He reached out after the gala. I saw him for coffee. Gio looked at her for a long moment. His expression was still warm, still social, but the calculation behind it had stopped pretending not to be there. You're a smart woman, Vivian, he said. You always have been. Damien used to say that all the time early on. Vivian's the smart one. Don't let her know you think so or she'll use it. He smiled, and the smile was the worst thing about him. I'm just going to say, this is a busy time for the organization, a lot of restructuring, a lot of moving parts. This is probably a good time to be restful, you know? Focus on the recovery. She looked at him. She said, Thank you for the advice, Gio. He held her gaze for 3 more seconds. Then he nodded, once, and went to the door and let himself out. She stood in the front hallway after the door closed, and she counted her breaths. 1, 2, 3. And she thought about what had just happened with the specificity it required. He knew she was moving. He didn't know what she had or how far along she was, or he would have done something more direct than a social call with a thin envelope. But he knew she was talking to people she shouldn't be talking to, and he had come to tell her he knew, and the telling was a warning, and the warning was also, she understood with cold precision, a communication to someone else. I flagged it. I covered it. The threat is being managed. She opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a copy of an old household account authorization with her signature on it, one of dozens she had signed over the years for routine family expenses. Nothing significant. The paperwork was a prop. He had come to look at her and deliver a message, and the paper was the excuse that had gotten him in the door. She went to the kitchen and sat down and thought with the focused speed of someone who has just had their clock significantly adjusted. Gio had been watching her. Gio reported to Celeste, or worked alongside her, or both. The precise nature of the arrangement mattered less than the fact of it, and Celeste, therefore, might now know that Vivian was not simply recovering. Might know, or suspect, that there was movement happening. She pulled out her private phone and called Bernard Couot. I need you to move, she said when he answered. Whatever you have, finalized or not, I need a copy in a secure location outside your office within 24 hours. Something happened, he said. Possibly. I don't know the scope yet. Move the copies, Bernard. Done, he said. She called Adria Santos next. I need you to move your copies to the location we discussed, she said. Today. Today, Adria repeated. Her voice was careful. How serious? Serious enough that I'm not waiting to find out. She called Luca Bertone. She called Frank Morrow. She told both of them to expect nothing from her for the next 72 hours and to conduct themselves as they normally would and to make no contact with anyone connected to the Romano organization. She called Sylvie Park and told her the certification hold needed to be airtight and asked if there was any pressure being applied from the Romano side, and Sylvie said, not yet, not directly, but that she had received an informal call from someone at the organization asking about the timeline, and she had said end of month as planned. Keep saying end of month, Vivian told her, and call me if that call gets less informal. She was on the phone with Carver. She had the agent's direct number now, on the private cell. When Damien came home, she heard the front door and ended the call and put the phone in her jacket pocket and was standing at the kitchen counter when he came through the hallway, still in his coat, and she looked at his face and the floor dropped out. He knew. Not everything. She could read how much a person knew from the specific quality of the way they looked at you, and she had been reading Damien Romano for 20 years. He didn't know the documents. He didn't know Carver or Bernard or Adria, but he knew something. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not anger, not hurt, not the compressed managerial expression he wore when he was moving pieces. Something rawer than any of those. Something that looked almost like grief, which was the most frightening expression she had ever seen on him, because Damien Romano did not grieve visibly. And the fact that what she was looking at had broken through the surface meant that whatever had put it there had hit him somewhere he had not been defending. Gio called me, he said. She stood still. Okay. He said you've been talking to people. His voice was stripped of everything except the weight of the thing underneath it. Luca Bertone, Frank Morrow. He said you've been... He stopped. What are you doing, Vivian? She looked at her husband. She thought about 28 days. She thought about Carver's case and the uncertified documents and Bernard's copies and Adria's copies and all the careful architecture of the things she had been building for 7 weeks. She thought about all the ways this moment could go, and she ran them quickly with the speed that had been building in her across all those weeks of precise and patient work. "I've been talking to old friends," she said. "I've been catching up." "Don't." His voice cracked on the single syllable. "Don't do that. Don't give me the version you give everyone else. I'm asking you what you're doing." The room was very still. Outside, the winter dark had come down fully, and the kitchen windows showed only the reflection of the two of them standing on opposite sides of the room, and she thought, this is the moment. This is the point at which everything either holds or doesn't. She said, "I know about the financial restructuring. I know what the documents you signed actually do. I know about the shell companies and the redirected funds, and I know how much has moved in 14 months, and I know exactly where it went." She kept her voice level. "I also know about the gala." He stared at her. "What about the gala?" "The device wasn't a gas conduit failure," she said. "It was placed, and the person who placed it was working for someone who knew your security protocols in specific detail and who positioned you off the host table before it went off." She paused. "You were never supposed to leave that building, Damien." The color left his face, not gradually. It went the way color goes when a body receives information that is too large for it to process at normal speed, a sudden physical surrender of something that had been maintained by a kind of muscular faith. He put one hand on the back of the nearest kitchen chair, and she watched his knuckles go pale. "What are you saying?" he said. His voice had dropped to something she barely recognized. "I'm saying she was going to kill you," Vivian said. "I'm saying she has been moving your money into structures she controls. She has been removing everyone around you who might have seen it. She moved you off that platform before the bomb she had planted went off, and she has been standing next to you since then because she needs you to keep signing things until the transfer is complete." She watched his face. "I'm saying you have been played." "Completely. For 18 months. By someone who knew exactly what you wanted and exactly what you couldn't see." Damien Romano stood in his kitchen with his hand on the back of a chair, and he did not speak for a long time. She could see him breathing, the rise and fall of it visible beneath his coat, faster than normal, the breathing of a man whose body was trying to metabolize something his mind had not caught up to. She watched him, and she felt, despite everything, despite all of it, the complicated weight of watching someone you have known for 20 years receive information that is destroying something inside them. She did not soften it. She did not reach for him. She simply stood and let him absorb it, because there was no gentle version of this truth available, and manufacturing one would have been its own kind of cruelty. "You've been investigating her," he said finally. It wasn't an accusation. It was flat, the voice of a man arriving at understanding. "Yes." "How long?" "Since the hospital." He looked at her. "And you didn't tell me." She held his gaze. "Would you have listened?" The silence that followed that question was the longest silence in their 20 years. It stretched, and she did not move, and he did not move, and outside a car passed on the street, and its headlights swept briefly through the kitchen windows and were gone. He knew the answer. She knew he knew it. The answer was no. The answer was that the Damien Romano of 7 weeks ago, comfortable, certain, holding his wine across a candlelit dinner table and talking about spring travel while his mistress held executive authority over his empire, that man would not have listened to his wife tell him the woman he had chosen was a predator. That man would have called it jealousy, would have called it paranoia, would have called it exactly what she had been called, quietly, persistently, for years, whenever she had raised concerns about the organization's people or direction. "You're being paranoid, Vivian. You don't understand how this works, Vivian. Let me handle it." "No," he said. The word came out stripped of everything. "No," she agreed. He pulled out the chair and sat down heavily in it. He put both elbows on the table and his face in his hands, and she stood and watched him do it, and she thought, he is not the enemy. He was never the enemy. He was the mechanism. The door someone else walked through. "How bad is it?" he said from behind his hands. "The financial exposure? 11.3 million over 14 months. The restructuring documents transfer effective control of three major entities to her. If those documents are certified, they won't be certified, he said immediately. His hands came down from his face. I'll stop the certification. It's already being held, she said. He looked at her. Something crossed his face that she could not fully name. Not gratitude exactly, and not guilt exactly, and not either of those things separately or together, but some compound of both and several other things besides. A look that was the face of a man who has just understood the size of what he failed to see and the size of what the person he failed to see it with has done in the time since. The feds, he said. His voice was careful. She said nothing. You've already talked to the feds, he said. Not a question. She said nothing. He stood up. He stood up and walked to the kitchen window and stood looking at the black glass with his reflection in it, and his back to her. And she watched the set of his shoulders, the slight rise and fall of his breathing, and she thought about the thing Carver had said. She's not working alone. She never has. And she thought about Gio Ferrante standing in this hallway this afternoon with a thin envelope and a warm smile. And you've been busy, Vivian. And she thought about the sequence of events she had just set in motion by being in this room telling Damien what she had told him. And she thought, who does he call first? That was the question. When she left this room, and she would have to leave this room, she could not stay in it indefinitely. When she walked out, who did Damien Romano call first? Did he call Paul Dietz? Did he call a lawyer? Did he call Celeste, the way men sometimes call the people who have hurt them? Because the hurt creates a gravity that rational decision-making cannot immediately overcome, and he had been sleeping beside this woman, and he did not yet fully have his footing back. Or did he call Gio? She thought about Gio's eyes in this hallway this afternoon. She thought about the quality of the warning he had delivered, and what it implied about how much Celeste's operation had anticipated. She thought about an organization that had been through this before, 3 times, that had refined its methodology across 3 prior targets, that had thought of contingencies she had not thought of because she was one person and they were a structure, and structures had redundancies that individuals did not have. She thought, what contingency have I not thought of? And then her private phone, the one in her jacket pocket, the one only 6 people in the world had the number for, rang. She pulled it out. The screen showed a number she did not recognize. She answered it because not answering an unknown number on a private line at this precise moment felt like a more dangerous choice than answering it. Mrs. Romano. The voice was male, flat, without regional accent, the voice of someone who had spent time training the identifiable out of their speech. You've had a productive evening. I think it's time we talked about what happens now. A pause, short and deliberate. We have Bernard Quo. The kitchen was very still. Damien was still at the window with his back to her, and she stood with the phone against her ear, and she felt the full weight of what those 4 words meant settle through her like cold water finding its level, and she thought, there it is. The contingency I did not think of. She did not let the silence go long enough to become readable. Where is he? She said. He's comfortable, the voice said. He'll stay comfortable as long as you make a smart decision in the next few hours. What decision? You pull back. Everything you've built, every copy, every contact. You walk it back. You tell your federal friend the information was misread, that you made assumptions that weren't supported. You let the certification go through on schedule, and then you go back to being what you were before the gala. A pause that had been timed, she could feel the timing of it, practiced. You're good at that. Being invisible. Go back to it. She was looking at Damien's back at the kitchen window. He had not moved. He could not hear the call. She turned slightly away from him, not enough to signal anything, just enough to give the next words a degree of privacy. I need proof of life, she said. A sound on the line, but movement, a door, the specific ambient shift of a phone being carried through a space, and then Bernard Quo's voice felt tightly controlled, the voice of a man who was frightened but was applying professional discipline to the fear. Vivian, I'm all right, And then the ambient shift reversed, and the flat voice came back. You have until 10 tomorrow morning, the voice said. After that, his comfort becomes variable. The line went dead. She stood holding the phone for 2 seconds. 2 seconds exactly. She counted them, because she needed to know how long she had stood still before she started moving again. Then she put the phone in her pocket, and she turned back to the room and she said, Damien, I need you to sit down, and I need you to listen to me, and I need you to not react until I've finished. Can you do that? He turned from the window. He looked at her face, and something in what he saw there told him enough that he crossed to the table and sat without asking questions. She sat across from him. She told him about Bernard Couot in the time and language that the situation required. Enough that he understood the stakes, not so much that she lost the next 90 seconds to his reaction. She told him what the call had demanded. She told him she had no intention of complying. They have your accountant, he said. Yes. And you're not going to give them what they want. No. He looked at her with eyes that were trying to read something they were not sure they had the vocabulary for anymore. Then what? He said. Then I need 2 things from you, she said. I need every piece of access you have to Celeste's operational structure inside the organization, her office, her files, the digital system she's been using. And I need Marcus. Marcus, he repeated. He found me in the rubble, she said. He said my name twice. I think he's still mine. Damien was quiet for a moment. What are you going to do? I'm going to finish what I started, she said. But I need to do it tonight, before 10 tomorrow morning, before whoever is holding Bernard gets a response or doesn't get one and makes a decision about what that means. He looked at her for a long time across the kitchen table in the house they had shared for 18 years, and she could see him moving through something internal that she did not try to read too precisely, because it wasn't hers to read, and because she did not have the time, and because some things between 2 people have to be moved through without an audience, even when the audience is each other. Then he took out his phone and he called Marcus and he said, Come to the house, now, and come alone. Marcus arrived in 14 minutes. He was a large man, not tall, but wide through the shoulders, with a face that had been broken in at least 2 places over the years and had healed imperfectly, and which wore its history the way working faces do, visibly, without apology. He came into the kitchen and looked at Damien and then at Vivian, and he said nothing, waiting. You're working for her tonight, Damien said. He said it without elaboration, and Marcus looked at Vivian, and she saw in his face something she had hoped was there and had not been entirely certain of until this moment. A quality of settled recognition, the look of a man who has been waiting for a particular alignment to arrive and has found it. Tell me what you need, Marcus said. She told him about Bernard, what she knew, which was the fact of the call and the voice and the timed quality of it, which meant it was not improvised, which meant the location where Bernard was being held had been prepared in advance, which meant it was either a property connected to the Celeste operation or a property connected to Gio Ferrante, who was the operational arm she could document. She told Marcus she needed every property connected to Gio that he was aware of. Not the Romano family's records, Marcus's own knowledge. The things a man accumulates over 9 years of working security in close proximity to an organization's daily business. Marcus thought for 40 seconds. She watched him think, the stillness of it, the internal catalog being searched. Gio has a warehouse on the east side he's held since before he came into the Romano operation, he said. Off books. I only know it because I drove him there twice 3 years ago, and he didn't tell me why. He paused. And there's a place in the North End, residential. He told Damien it was his cousin's, but I ran the address once, and the cousin's name isn't on the title. Which one first? She said. The warehouse, Marcus said. It's more contained, easier to hold someone without noise. She nodded. She looked at Damien. I need your access credentials for Celeste's office system, she said. The executive access you gave her in the restructuring documents. It runs through the Romano administrative platform. You still have override authority as the original account holder. You want her files, he said. I want everything on her servers that she didn't have time to clean, she said. She knows I'm moving. She doesn't know how far I've gotten. There's a window between what she thinks she needs to protect and what's actually still exposed, and that window closes when her people get a response from me or don't. Damien pulled up the administrative platform on his phone, and walked her through the override credentials, his voice flat and procedural. The voice of a man who has reorganized his interior around a task because that is the only way he knows to function when the interior becomes too large to hold still. She memorized the credentials as he gave them, and she did not write them down. And when he finished, she said, "Thank you," and she meant it plainly, without weight, because the moment did not need weight added to it. She called Adria Santos from the front hallway. It was past 9 in the evening, and Adria answered on the second ring, which meant she had not been asleep, which meant she had been waiting for some version of this call. "I need you to receive a file transfer tonight," Vivian said. "Large. I don't know exactly what's in it yet. I need you to hold it with the other materials, and I need you to have it in a format that Carver's office can receive by 8 tomorrow morning." "That's a tight window," Adria said. "I know." "What happened?" "They took my accountant." A sharp intake of breath, controlled almost immediately. "Are you safe?" "Yes, I'm moving." She paused. "Adria, whatever comes through that transfer tonight, I need you to look at it and tell me if there's anything in it about the gala, about the device, about who was contracted for the placement." "You think she kept records?" Adria said. "I think she's kept records of everything," Vivian said. "That's who she is. People like her keep records because records are leverage, and leverage is the thing they hoard above everything else. The question is whether there's a copy on a system I can access in the next 3 hours." She hung up and went back to the kitchen where Marcus was on his own phone, speaking quietly and quickly in a way that told her he was calling someone he trusted from before his Romano years. The kind of contact a man keeps separate from his professional life precisely for the moments when the professional life becomes impossible to operate inside. He finished and looked at her. "I have 2 people who can come to the warehouse with me," he said. "Not family people." "Good," she said. "Take them. I don't want anyone connected to the Romano structure in that building tonight." "What about you?" "I'll be here," she said. "I'm running the file transfer. That's my job tonight." Marcus looked at her steadily. "If Bernard isn't at the warehouse, then you go to the North End address," she said. "But don't go dark on me. I need to know what you're finding as you find it." He nodded once and left. She heard the front door close, and she stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, and she breathed, deliberately, 4 counts in, 4 counts out, because her heart was doing something loud and insistent in her chest, and she needed it to settle into a pace she could work with. The left shoulder had been aching for the past hour with the specific deep bone complaint of a fracture that was healed enough to be functional and not healed enough to be ignored, and she had been ignoring it and would continue to ignore it, and the ache was simply information, like everything else tonight, filed and set aside. She sat at the kitchen table with Damien's credentials and her laptop. She had it in the car. She had carried it in when Marcus left. She was not going to do this on a household machine. And she opened the Romano administrative platform and logged into Celeste's executive account with the override access, and she started pulling files. There were a lot of files. Celeste was, as Vivian had assessed, a person who documented obsessively. The documentation was part of the operational model. It was how she maintained leverage over the people and situations she moved through. It was the institutional memory of an operation that had learned, over 3 prior iterations, that having records on everyone was more valuable than having loyalty from anyone. The file structure was organized with a precision that Vivian found simultaneously repellent and useful, because a well-organized system was a fast system to search, and fast was what she needed. She started with the financial files. She found 3 layers of documentation that Bernard's external analysis had only partially captured. Internal transfer records that showed not just where the money had gone, but the deliberate sequencing of how it had been moved, the timing calibrated to stay under automatic monitoring thresholds, the methodology annotated in brief technical notes that read, in Celeste's clipped, precise language, like the working notes of someone who had done this before and was refining the technique with each iteration. She sent these to Adria in a compressed transfer and kept pulling. Damien sat across the table from her and did not speak, and did not look at his phone, and did not do anything except exist in the room with her, which was something she had not asked him to do, and which she acknowledged to herself quietly, cost him something to do in the way that all forms of helplessness cost a man like Damien Romano something. She found the personnel files 40 minutes in. The manufactured records, The falsified discrepancies planted in Luca Bertone's division logs, the altered correspondence in Frank Morrow's council liaison files, 3 other sets of records she had not previously known about, 2 additional family members whose exits she had not connected to the pattern. All of it documented in Celeste's system with cold administrative clarity, including, and here Vivian stopped and read twice to make sure she was reading what she thought she was reading, a notation on each file indicating which of Celeste's people had performed the alteration, what system access had been used, and when. It was a record of her own crimes, kept because the crimes were also her leverage, and she needed to be able to prove, to her own people, that she had the documentation to destroy anyone who deviated. She sent it all to Adria. Her hands were steady on the keyboard. The shoulder complained. She ignored it. At 11:14, Marcus called. "He's here," he said. "He's okay. He's angry, which means he's okay." She closed her eyes for 2 seconds. "Get him somewhere safe," she said. "Not his home. Not anywhere connected to the Romano organization. Do you have a place?" "Yes." "Take him there. Tell him to stay off his phone except for my number and to wait for me to call him." She paused. "Marcus, thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said, and hung up. She found the Gala file at 11:41. It was nested inside a project management directory labeled with an alphanumeric code that meant nothing on its face, and she only found it because she was running a keyword search on the term Alderton, and it surfaced in a document title 3 directories deep. She opened it, and she sat very still for the 60 seconds it took her to read what was there, and then she read it again. It was not complete. It was the kind of document that had clearly had sections removed, either manually or through an automated deletion protocol that had not finished running before she accessed the system. What remained was partial but sufficient. A project timeline, dates, times, action items assigned to initials she could partially decode. GF was Gio Ferrante, she was certain of that. And the external contractor was referenced by a single letter that told her nothing specific but told Carver's forensic analyst something. She was confident, because these things always told analysts something when they had the tools to look. There was a budget line for the contractor. There was a notation about the target configuration, primary package, host platform, full occupancy, that made her stomach move in a way she gave herself 1 second to feel before she set it aside and kept reading. There was a line that said DR position, floor, confirmed 2130. Damian Romano's position confirmed off the platform at 9:30, 17 minutes before the device went off. Confirmed. Someone had confirmed his position to Celeste 17 minutes before the explosion. Someone who was in that ballroom. She sent the file to Adria. Then she sat back in her chair and she looked at Damian across the table and she said, "There was someone in the room that night. Someone who confirmed to her that you were off the platform before it went off." His face did something she could not fully read. "Who?" he said. "I don't know yet. The document uses initials." She paused. "Carver will know." He was quiet. "She had someone in the room," he said. The flatness in his voice had a quality she recognized from the moments in their marriage when he was most dangerous. Not the anger that made noise, but the anger that went absolutely silent, that went below the level where sound lived, into something older and colder and more final. "Yes," she said. "At my table." "Possibly, or on the floor, within visual range of the platform." He stood up. He walked to the window again. She had a feeling he was going to spend a significant portion of the rest of his life at that window. And he stood with his back to her, and the muscles across his shoulders were tight enough to be visible through his jacket, and she watched him breathe. "What do you need from me now?" he said. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "There's a gathering scheduled. The quarterly meeting with the affiliated families. Celeste is presenting the restructuring as a fait accompli. She was going to use it to announce the effective leadership transfer to the other bosses. Make it public among the families before anyone could contest it." She had known about this meeting for 2 weeks. Paul Dietz had told her about it in the careful language of a man passing information while technically saying nothing. "I need you to be there." He turned from the window. "And what happens when I'm there?" "What happens," she said, "is that she presents her version and then I present mine." She held his gaze. "I need you in that room. I need you to hear it in front of witnesses. And I need you to be willing to say, in front of those witnesses, what you know and what you authorized and what you didn't." He looked at her for a long moment. "You want me to confess in front of every boss in the region." "I want you to tell the truth in front of every boss in the region," she said. "Those are different things." "Not in that room, they're not." "I know," she said. "I know what I'm asking." The silence between them was different from the silences earlier in the night. This one had a weight that was specific to the thing being asked, which was considerable. She was asking him to walk into a room full of men whose respect he had spent his entire adult life earning, and to stand in front of them and tell them he had been managed and deceived by a woman he had trusted over his own wife, his own people, his own judgment. She was asking him to do the most difficult thing a man like Damian Romano could do, which was to be seen to have been wrong. She did not soften it. She did not add reassurances she didn't have to give. She sat and waited and let him hold the full weight of it. "What time?" he said. 9 o'clock, she said. "The Meridian Club. That's where Paul said it was scheduled." He nodded once. The nod of a man who has made a decision that he is not going to second-guess, because second-guessing it is a luxury he has used up. He looked at her across the kitchen with the specific expression of someone who has just understood, with a clarity that came too late to change the shape of things, but not too late to change what happened next, the size of what had been standing in front of him all along. "I'll be there," he said. She called Carver at 12:30 in the morning. Carver answered in 2 rings, which meant she had not been sleeping either, which meant something in the day's events had put her on alert before Vivian's call. "I have a file transfer coming to you from Adria Santos," Vivian said. "It should be complete by 5 a.m. Inside it is documentation of the financial scheme, the falsified personnel records, and a partial project file for the gala bombing, including a target configuration notation and a contractor budget line." She paused. "I also have Bernard Kuo safe and available for testimony." A silence on Carver's end that had the quality of controlled professional response to a large amount of incoming information. "Mrs. Romano, the quarterly meeting of affiliated families is at 9 tomorrow morning at the Meridian Club," Vivian said. "Celeste Vaughn is scheduled to present the restructuring as a completed leadership transfer. I intend to be in that room. I need your people to be outside it." Inside would blow the operation before I finished," she said. "Outside, ready. When I send you the signal, you come in." "What's the signal?" "I'll call you," she said. "When I call, come in." Another silence. "This is not how federal operations work," Carver said. "I know," Vivian said, "but you've been building this case for 3 years and I'm handing you the moment to close it. Are you going to tell me procedural framework is more important than closing it?" The silence this time was different. The silence of a federal agent who has been in the business long enough to know when the textbook and the moment are pulling in different directions and has made a private decision about which one she's following. "We'll be outside," Carver said. "Don't make me wait long." "I won't," Vivian said. She did not sleep. She worked through the file transfer, checked with Adria twice by text to confirm receipt, reviewed her own documentation one final time, not for new information, but for the calm that comes from knowing the shape of what you're carrying, from being certain that what you have is what you believe you have. At 4:30, she showered and changed and stood in the bathroom of the Westfield house, looking at herself in the mirror with the particular quality of attention a person gives themselves before something that cannot be undone. Her shoulder was stiff in the cold. Her face was tired in the specific way that goes bone deep and does not come out on the other side of a single night's sleep. She looked at herself and she thought about the woman who had stood in this bathroom 1,000 mornings, looking at a life that fit perfectly from the outside. And she thought about the woman she was now looking at, who had spent 7 weeks dismantling the architecture of her own invisibility to build something that would outlast it. And she thought those 2 women were the same woman and were not the same woman, and the distance between them was measured not in time, but in a single sentence spoken into a security radio on the night a building came down. "Save Celeste first." She picked up her bag. She went downstairs. Damien was in the kitchen, already dressed, standing at the counter with a cup of coffee he hadn't drunk, and he looked up when she came in, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because there was nothing that needed to be said that had not already been said. And the things that remained unsaid were not going to be said in this kitchen on this morning, with 9 o'clock coming like a wall. "Ready?" she said. "Ready," he said. They drove separately. She had always known they would drive separately. She followed his taillights out of the Westfield driveway and onto the main road, and then she let the distance between them grow because that distance was already real and had been real for longer than either of them had been willing to name, and naming it now, on this morning, was simply the honest acknowledgement of a thing that the next few hours were going to make permanent. The Meridian Club was a limestone building on the north side of the city that had been hosting the kind of meetings that did not appear in any publicly accessible calendar for 40 years. She parked 2 blocks away. She sat in the car for 3 minutes. She felt her heart beat. Steady, louder than usual, the body's honest report on the situation. She felt the shoulder. She felt the cold coming in around the door seals. She felt all of it, and she named none of it. And she got out of the car and she walked toward the building in the gray 9 o'clock light, with everything she had built in 7 weeks of precise and patient and solitary work, carried in a leather document case in her left hand, the hurt hand, the hand that had been broken by the same explosion that had broken the last assumption she'd had about the life she'd been living. She pushed open the door of the Meridian Club and walked in. The room where the quarterly meeting was held was on the 2nd floor, accessed through a corridor paneled in dark wood that smelled of old money and older arrangements. She could hear voices through the closed double doors at the end of it, the specific low register of men in a room that has always been theirs, talking in the easy register of people who are not yet aware that the room is about to change. She walked the corridor without slowing. She put her hand on the door handle. Behind her, at the building's entrance, she heard the door open again, and she knew without looking that it was Damien coming in behind her, arriving at the moment she had asked him to arrive at, honoring the last thing she had asked him for. She pushed the doors open and walked in. The room went quiet the way rooms go quiet when something enters that does not belong in the script. The sudden recalibration of a space whose inhabitants have been disrupted mid-assumption. There were 11 people in the room. She registered them in the first 2 seconds of standing in the doorway. 8 men she knew by sight and history. Paul Dietz in the far corner with the expression of a man who had been prepared for this moment and was grateful it had arrived, and Gio Ferrante standing near the window with his face going through something fast and uncontrolled that he was trying to contain and failing. And at the head of the long table, with a presentation already visible on the screen behind her, and her hands flat on the tabletop, and her face arranging itself into the composed, slightly contemptuous expression of a woman who has been interrupted at the precise worst moment, Celeste Vaughn. They looked at each other across the length of the room. "Gentlemen," Vivian said, and her voice did not shake, and she walked to the table and set down the document case and opened it, and she said, "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there are some things in this room that belong to me, and I've come to take them back." The room held its silence for 3 full seconds after she spoke. 3 seconds in which 11 people recalibrated, in which the air redistributed itself around the fact of her presence, in which Celeste Vaughn's face performed a rapid and nearly invisible sequence of adjustments. Surprise, suppression of surprise, recalculation, and then the settling of something cold and deliberate into the features of a woman who had been interrupted before and had learned that being interrupted was simply the beginning of a different kind of control. "Vivian?" Celeste said. Her voice was even, not warm, not hostile, the temperature of someone who has decided that visible emotion is a liability. "This is a private meeting." "I know what it is," Vivian said. She did not look at Celeste when she said it. She was looking at the 8 men around the table, the bosses of affiliated families, men she had met at dinners and funerals, and the particular social events that existed in the overlap between organized power and its public performance. Men who knew her as Damien's wife. Men who had looked at her across tables for 20 years the way men in rooms like this looked at wives. Present, noted, not the point. She looked at each of them in turn, and she let them see that she was not the same arrangement of person they had catalogued and filed and forgotten about, and she watched the room's understanding of the situation begin to shift its weight. She heard the doors open behind her, Damien. She did not turn around. She heard him walk in and stop, somewhere behind her right shoulder, and she heard the specific quality of silence that moved through the room when the men at the table registered his presence alongside hers and understood that this was not a wife who had wandered into the wrong meeting. This was something that had been constructed and was now being executed. Damien. One of the men at the table, Victor Salcedo, 68 years old, the head of the West Side Salcedo operation, a man who had dealt with Damien's father before he dealt with Damien, said his name with the precise flatness of a man who was reserving judgment while he gathered information. What is this? Damien came to stand beside Vivian, not behind her, not in front of her. Beside. She registered it without turning her head. Let her speak, Damien said. Gio Ferrante moved. She caught it in her peripheral vision, a shift of his body weight toward the door, a fractional repositioning that was the physical grammar of a man calculating an exit. She had anticipated this. She said without looking at him, Gio, sit down. There's nowhere you go from here that I haven't already been. She heard him stop. She heard him breathe. She heard him decide, in the particular silence of a man who has run the calculation and found no number that works in his favor, to stay where he was. She opened the document case. She took out the first set of materials, printed copies of Bernard Couot's report summary, the critical pages, the ones that showed the financial movement in its clearest form, and she set them on the table and she began. She spoke for 11 minutes without stopping. She had rehearsed the 11 minutes in her head across the drive from Westfield, had arranged it the way you arrange an argument when you know that the people you're delivering it to are going to resist it, and that your only tool against their resistance is the weight and precision of the evidence itself. She walked them through the 14 months of redirected funds. She walked them through the shell company structure. She walked them through the manufactured personnel records, naming Luca Bertone, naming Frank Morrow, watching the faces of the men at the table shift when they heard names they recognized, names of men they had known, men whose exits they had accepted as ordinary, when they were now understanding were not ordinary at all. She put the Gala project file on the table, the partial document, the target configuration notation, the budget line, the DR position, floor, confirmed 2130, and she let them read it, and she watched them read it, and she watched the temperature of the room change in a way that was not metaphorical but was almost physical, a drop in something that had nothing to do with the building's heating. Celeste spoke once during the 11 minutes. She said, "These documents are fabricated." Her voice was still even, still controlled. The voice of a woman who has been in difficult rooms before and knows that maintaining composure is the last asset available when the evidentiary ground has shifted beneath you. "By whom?" Vivian said, and looked at her directly for the first time since she'd entered the room. Celeste held the look. Her eyes were what Vivian had always found most unsettling about her. Not cold exactly, but calibrated in a way that true coldness wasn't. Coldness was the absence of something. What Celeste's eyes contained was not an absence. It was a presence that had simply decided long ago that other people's interiority was exclusively data. "By whoever is running you," Celeste said, "federal interference in family business is not new." "The federal involvement," Vivian said, "is a consequence of the evidence, not a source of it." She looked around the table. "The forensic accountant who produced this report is Bernard Couot, former federal financial crimes investigator, 22 years, currently independent. His methodology is documented and defensible in any court in this country. The attorney who preserved the internal documents from the Romano legal operation is Adria Santos, who left this organization 2 years ago when she was pressured to authorize financial movements she could not ethically certify." She paused. "These are not federal plants. These are people your organization discarded when they became inconvenient, and they kept records on the way out because they are professionals, and professionals keep records." Victor Salcedo had his hands flat on the table, and he was looking at the Gala project file, and his face had the expression of a man who is doing arithmetic that he does not like the sum of. "The bombing," he said. He did not phrase it as a question. He said it the way men in his position say the things they are arriving at, as statement, as acknowledgement that understanding has occurred, as the first step of a reckoning. "Yes," Vivian said. "She tried to take out Damien at his own event, along with 3 board members. The device was positioned under the host platform. The primary package was designed for full occupancy. She heard a sound from somewhere at the table. Not quite a word, not quite silence, the compressed exhalation of a man absorbing something he finds genuinely difficult to absorb. She moved him off the platform 17 minutes before the device activated. Someone in that room confirmed his position to her. We don't yet have the name of that person. Federal investigators do. The last sentence landed in the room with the specific weight of a thing that cannot be taken back. She watched it move through the men at the table, watched them process what federal investigators meant in the context of everything else she had just laid down, watched them begin the private, rapid calculation of their own exposure, their own tangential connections to the Romano organization, the meetings and transactions and arrangements that existed in the space between their operations and the organization that was currently being disassembled in front of them. Celeste stood up. It was the first time she had moved from her position at the head of the table since Vivian had entered, and the standing up had a quality of decision to it, a woman choosing to meet something on her feet rather than absorb it seated. She was still composed. The composure was extraordinary, Vivian thought, in the specific way that a thing can be extraordinary and terrible at the same time. You've been building this for 7 weeks, Celeste said. Since the hospital. Since before the hospital, Vivian said. Since the moment I heard your name on a security radio while I was lying under a ceiling. Something crossed Celeste's face. Brief, half a second, there and gone. It was not guilt. Vivian did not think Celeste was organized around guilt in any functional way. It was something more operational than that. The recognition of where the breach had been, the identification of the exact moment the variable had been miscalculated. The radio. The 4 words. The assumption that a woman buried under rubble was finished rather than paying attention. You should have been at that table, Celeste said quietly, almost to herself. The seating arrangement had you at the host table. I was at the host table, Vivian said. I got up to speak to the event coordinator, 3 minutes before 9:47. She let that sit. I don't know if that was luck or something else. I've stopped trying to decide. Celeste looked at her for a long moment with those calibrated eyes, and then she said something that Vivian had not expected, that no version of the 11 minutes she had rehearsed had included, something that arrived in the room like a weather change. You're better at this than I thought you were. It was not an apology. It was not a concession. It was the professional assessment of one operator acknowledging another across the table of a finished game, and Vivian received it without expression and without response because there was no response that did not diminish the weight of everything in the room around them. Gio Ferrante made his move then. She had been half waiting for it, had known, at some level, that the moment Celeste's composure shifted from active defense to assessment, Gio would understand that the defense was over and would attempt the only option remaining to him, which was to not be in the room when whatever came next came. He went for the door fast, faster than a man his size should have been able to move, and he was almost at it when Marcus stepped through it from the outside. And Marcus was not a man you got past when he had decided you were not getting past him. And Gio discovered this in approximately 1 second, and then he was still. Vivian took out her phone, and she called Carver, and she said one word. Now. They came in through 3 entrances simultaneously. She could hear it, the coordinated movement of it, federal agents entering a building the way they did when the building had been scouted and the entry points identified in advance, which they had been because Carver was not a woman who did things incompletely. They came into the meeting room through the main doors and through a side entrance Vivian had identified on a building diagram she had obtained 3 days prior, and the men at the table went very still in the particular way that powerful men go still when they understand that the kind of power they hold has just become temporarily irrelevant to the situation they are in. Carver herself came through the main doors. She looked at the room, at the table, at the documents, at Celeste standing at the head of it, at Gio Ferrante being held near the side entrance by Marcus and one of Carver's agents, and she looked at Vivian, and she gave a nod that was small and precise, and contained a quantity of professional acknowledgement that Vivian accepted without theatrics. Celeste Vaughn, Carver said, I have a warrant for your arrest on charges including wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to commit murder, and use of an explosive device. She walked toward the head of the table. Gio Ferrante, same warrant. She looked at the men at the table. The 8 bosses, Victor Salcedo with his hand still flat on the table, the others in various arrangements of stillness. Gentlemen, no one else in this room is being detained today. I would strongly encourage you to speak to your individual attorneys before you speak to anyone else. She paused. That's not a courtesy. That's advice. Celeste was handcuffed without incident. This was the detail Vivian remembered most clearly afterward. The absence of incident. No resistance, no dramatic gesture, no final speech. Celeste allowed her wrists to be taken and the cuffs applied, and she looked at Vivian once more across the room as she was being walked out, and the look contained nothing that Vivian could read as defeat, because defeat required a person to have believed in something other than their own operation. And Celeste Vaughn had not believed in anything other than her own operation for long enough that she had perhaps forgotten there was anything else to believe in. The look was simply the look of a woman filing a final data point. And then she was gone through the door. The room after that had the quality of a space that has been through something structural and is still settling. Men moved and spoke in low voices and found their phones and called people. Paul Dietz crossed to Vivian and stood in front of her and looked at her with the face of a man who has been in a long, bad weather system and has just come out the other side of it into something he did not allow himself to imagine while he was inside it. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Vivian?" and stopped. "I know, Paul," she said. "Go home." He nodded. He touched her arm, briefly, the arm that wasn't hurt, and then he went. Victor Salcedo stopped in front of her on his way out. He was the last of the 8 to leave, and he was not hurried about it. He looked at her with the eyes of a 68-year-old man who has seen many things and has calibrated his estimation of events against a long history of other events. "Your father-in-law was a serious man," he said. "I always thought the son had something missing." He paused. "I was wrong about what it was. He had it. He just didn't know where he'd put it." He looked at her for another moment. Then he walked out. Damien was standing near the window. He had been standing near the window for the past 20 minutes, through all of it, because near windows was apparently where Damien Romano went when the architecture of his understanding was being rebuilt from the ground up. She walked to him. She stood beside him, and they both looked out at the gray city morning and the street below where Carver's vehicles were parked and where, in a few minutes, Celeste Vaughn and Gio Ferrante would be driven away in the back of federal vehicles, and where the ordinary world was moving in the ordinary way that the ordinary world moves when extraordinary things are happening inside buildings it cannot see into. "It's done," she said. "Not all of it," he said. His voice was quiet. "No," she agreed. "Not all of it." He turned and looked at her. He looked at her with the face he had not shown her in years. Not the performance of a husband, not the management of a domestic situation, not the face of a man who is deciding how to handle something. Just his face. The face of a person who has been stripped of the things he used to construct himself with and is standing in what remains. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked at him. She thought about what sorry meant in the context of what had happened, about the radio and the ballroom and the hospital and the folder on the hall table and the candlelit dinner where he talked about spring travel while his signature was on documents that had transferred his empire to a woman who intended to bury him. She thought about 20 years of a certain kind of loyalty, not uncomplicated, not without its own costs and compromises and silences she wished she had broken differently, but real. She had loved him. In the past tense was where that sentence lived now. But the past tense did not make it untrue. "I know you are," she said. "That's not—" He stopped, started again. "I want to fix this. Some of it can be fixed," she said. "Some of it can't." She looked out the window. "Damien, you need to cooperate fully with the federal investigation, not because I'm asking you to, because it's the right thing, and because it's the only path through this that leaves you with anything." She paused. "Paul will help you. Retain outside counsel, someone not connected to the organization's history. Don't try to manage this the way you've managed everything else. This is not a thing that responds to management. He was quiet. And you, he said. She turned from the window. She picked up the document case from the table, lighter now, most of its contents distributed around the room, their work done, and she held it at her side. I'm going to get some air, she said, and then I'm going to go meet with a lawyer of my own. She walked out of the Meridian Club into the gray morning. The cold hit her face, and the shoulder reminded her it existed, and the city made its continuous indifferent noise around her, and she stood on the stone steps for a moment and breathed. Just breathed, counted nothing, measured nothing, assessed nothing. Let the air be cold and let the morning be what it was, and let the body report its inventory, tired, hurt, intact. And then she walked down the steps and along the street toward where she had parked the car. The divorce proceedings took 4 months. They were not easy months. Nothing about extricating 20 years of shared legal, financial, and domestic existence from another person's life was easy, even when both people had arrived at the understanding that it was necessary, even when no one was fighting the premise. There were assets to value and divide. There were accounts whose status depended on the outcome of the federal investigation, which moved with the grinding institutional patience of legal processes that are large and complicated and cannot be hurried by the impatience of individuals caught inside them. There were documents to sign and meetings to attend and conversations to have with lawyers who spoke in the particular language of legal dissolution, which was the language of things being made precise that had previously existed in the comfortable imprecision of assumption. Vivian attended all of it. She attended it in the apartment under her grandmother's name, which was now simply her apartment, which she had stopped thinking of as provisional. She attended it with her lawyer, a woman named Grace Okonkwo, who was 47 years old and who had the specific quality that Vivian had looked for and found. She did not need to be the smartest person in the room, she needed to be the most accurate one. Grace Okonkwo was extremely accurate. The federal case against Celeste V. Vaughn moved through the preliminary stages with the kind of evidentiary momentum that Bernard Kuo had promised when Vivian first retained him. The documentation was clean, the forensic trail was traceable, the partial Gala project file was enough to anchor the conspiracy charge when combined with the contractor's identification by federal analysts using the single-letter designation and the budget line. The contractor was apprehended in a different state 6 weeks after the Meridian Club meeting. His cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors provided the final piece of the bomb plot's chain of custody and named Gio Ferrante as the domestic coordinator, which corroborated what Vivian had provided and added the layer that prosecutors needed for the murder conspiracy charge to hold. Celeste entered a not guilty plea, which no one was surprised by, and retained a legal team of considerable expense and ability, which also surprised no one. The trial was scheduled for 14 months from the date of arrest. Vivian was prepared to testify. She had been prepared since before any of this began, in the way that a woman who has spent 7 weeks building a case out of patience and precision is prepared, not eagerly, not with any appetite for the theater of it, but completely. She would sit in a witness box and say what she knew in the language of what she could document, and she would let the weight of it do what weight does. Damien cooperated with the federal investigation. He retained outside counsel, a firm from out of state with no prior connection to the Romano organization, which had been Vivian's specific recommendation, and which he followed without argument, one of the things he followed without argument in those months, which was a version of him she had not encountered in 20 years, and which arrived too late to change what needed to be changed. He provided the prosecutors with a comprehensive account of the organization's operations over the prior 2 years, the decisions he had made, and the authorizations he had granted, and the things he had not seen because he had chosen not to see them. He said all of this in depositions that lasted multiple days, and in which, by every account from Grace Okonkwo, who had access to the transcripts, he was honest, not selectively honest, not strategically honest, just honest, in the blunt, stripped-down way of a man who has lost the energy required to be anything else and has found, at the bottom of that loss, something that might have been dignity if it had arrived differently. He did not contest the divorce. He signed what Grace Okonkwo placed in front of him. He sent Vivian one letter, handwritten, 3 pages, which she read once and then put in a box in the apartment's closet. She did not read it again. It was not that the letter was dishonest. She believed it was honest, believed he had written it in the same stripped-down mode he was conducting everything now. It was that honesty, at this stage, was not the same as repair, and she had stopped expecting repair to be available because some things, once they have come down, do not go back up in the same configuration, and trying to rebuild them in the same configuration was not restoration. It was repetition, and she was through with repetition. The legitimate assets she received in the settlement were substantial. The Romano family's legitimate holdings, the real estate portfolio, 3 operating businesses, the investment accounts registered to the family partnership, had been partially compromised by Celeste's redirection scheme. But Bernard Couot's work had provided a clean accounting of what was recoverable and what was lost, and the recovered portion, when Vivian applied Grace Okonkwo's considerable accuracy to the distribution, constituted enough to do something real with. She spent 6 weeks after the settlement finalized thinking about what real meant. She thought about it the way she had been thinking about things since the gala, with the patient, unromanticized attention of someone who has learned, at considerable cost, that clarity is more valuable than comfort. She thought about the people she had moved through in the 7 weeks of building her case: Luca Bertone, Frank Morrow, Paul Dietz, Adria Santos, Sylvie Park, Bernard Couot. And she thought about the people she had not directly moved through but had known about, had been aware of in the peripheral way that a woman inside a large organization accumulates awareness: the families. The wives and children and parents of the men who had spent their working lives in the service of a structure that had, as structures of that kind inevitably do, eventually consumed more than it created. The people who had not made choices so much as inherited the consequences of other people's choices. She called Adria Santos on a Tuesday in late spring. "I need a lawyer," she said, "who knows how to set up a legitimate business structure, multiple entities, employment generating, clean." "That's not what I do," Adria said. "I know. I need you to refer me to someone who does." A pause. "What are you building?" "Something that provides careers," Vivian said. "Stable ones. To people who've been working in unstable ones." She paused. "There are a lot of families connected to the Romano organization's history who are going to need to find different work when the federal proceedings finish and the organization is formally dissolved. Some of them have been in that world so long they don't know where else to go. I want to give them somewhere to go." Silence on Adria's end. Then, "Vivian, I'm not doing it for him," she said. "I'm not doing it for the Romano name. I'm doing it because I've been looking at these people for 20 years and they deserved better options than the ones that were available to them. And I have the means to create some of those options now. And I don't see why I should do anything else with the means." Adria was quiet for a moment longer. "I know someone," she said. "She's good. She'll take this seriously." "That's all I need," Vivian said. The first business opened in September. A logistics and warehousing operation on the east side of the city, 34 employees in the first quarter, all of them vetted by a process that Vivian designed herself. A process that prioritized people with work history inside organizations that were now dissolved or under federal investigation. People who were not charged with crimes, who had been working people rather than directing people, who had families and skills and no clean path forward. She was at the ribbon cutting, and she wore a gray blazer and low heels, and her hair was down, and she shook hands and said very little that was quotable and a great deal that was true. The shoulder had healed completely by then. The doctors had said 6 months, and it had taken 8, which she found characteristic of the way bodies dealt with damage. Slower than the schedule, stubbornly insistent on their own timeline, ultimately thorough. She woke up one morning in October in the apartment and lifted her left arm above her head without thinking about it, and there was no pain, and she stood there for a moment with her arm in the air in the blue October light, and she felt the absence of the pain with the same attention she had given the pain itself, because absences deserved attention too, and because she had learned, over the course of the year that had happened to her, that the body was the most honest narrator available, and that what it said when it finally stopped hurting was worth listening to. She had coffee with Monica Sewell in November at Monica's kitchen table in Connecticut, the way they'd had coffee 1,000 times. And Monica asked her how she was, and she said she was all right, and Monica looked at her in the way that a friend of 25 years looks at someone when she's deciding whether all right is accurate or diplomatic, and apparently determined it was accurate, because she nodded and moved on to asking about the logistics business. And Vivian told her about the 34 employees and the second location she was scouting, and Monica listened and smiled and refilled the coffee, and it was, Vivian thought, the most normal 2 hours she had spent in approximately 14 months. She thought about Damien sometimes. She could not pretend otherwise and would not have tried. 20 years was 20 years, and pretending it was cleanly excisable was not honesty. It was the self-protective fiction of someone who needed the story of their own life to be tidier than it was. She thought about him not with what she had once felt, and not with what she had felt in the worst months of the past year, but with something that had no clean English name. Something that was the residue of a thing that had been real, sitting where the real thing had been, occupying the shape of it without the warmth. She hoped he was doing the work he had said in his letter he intended to do. She did not know if he was. She did not have a mechanism for knowing anymore, which was the point of the divorce, which was correct. Celeste Vaughn was convicted on 6 of 7 counts, 14 months after her arrest, in a trial that ran 3 weeks and generated coverage Vivian did not read. She read the verdict notice that Grace Okonkwo sent her, and she sat with it for a few minutes, and then she got up and made tea and stood at the apartment window and looked at the city in the evening light. The sentencing was scheduled for 2 months out. Whatever number came out of it would be a number, and she would note it and move forward. Gio Ferrante had taken a cooperation agreement 6 months into the federal proceedings. He had provided information about 3 other operations connected to Celeste's network in exchange for a reduced charge. Vivian thought about Gio's smile in her hallway, the warmth on the surface, the calculation 3 layers below, and she thought that a man who had always operated through the strategic use of warmth would find cooperation agreements natural, because cooperation agreements were just a different kind of smile directed at a different kind of room. Bernard Quo sent her a bottle of wine after the verdict. She called to thank him, and he said the work had been interesting, and she said she hoped not to need him again, and he said he sincerely hoped the same, and they both laughed briefly, the laugh of 2 people who have been through something difficult together and are glad to be on the other side of it, and are not pretending the other side looks like anything other than what it looks like, ordinary and quiet and clean. On a morning in December, she drove to the East Side location and walked through the warehousing floor and spoke to the floor manager, a man named Desmond who had worked logistics for 12 years before his former employer's organization was dissolved in a separate federal action 2 years prior, and she listened to his rundown of the quarter's operations with the attention she gave everything now, which was the attention of a woman who had learned that what you pay attention to is what you protect, and that what you protect is ultimately what you are. Desmond was good at his job. He was careful, and he was clear, and he gave her the numbers without dressing them, and when they were done, he said, "Mrs. Romano," and she said, "Vivian, just Vivian." He nodded. "Vivian, this place, what you built here, it matters to people. I want you to know that." She looked at the floor, the organized movement of it, the people working in the specific focused way of people who have somewhere to be that is theirs and stable and paying and forward-pointing. She looked at it, and she felt something that she did not try to name immediately, because naming it too quickly would have diminished it. She let it be what it was, in the body, in the chest, in the place where 20 years of something had been, and where this thing, this different and simpler thing, was now beginning to take up residence. "Thank you, Desmond," she said. She drove home in the December light. The city ran past the windows in the particular way cities run past windows when you are not being driven by someone else. When it is your hands on the wheel and your choice of route and your window cracked 2 inches because you have always needed a little air when you drive, a habit no one else had ever known about her because it was too small a thing to mention and too constant a thing to change. She drove her own car on her own road at her own speed, and the radio played something she half recognized, and the cold came in through the 2-inch gap, and the shoulder said nothing, nothing at all. And the city went on around her in every direction, large and indifferent, and full of people navigating the specific weight of their own lives, none of whom knew what she had done or what it had cost, or what had been burned down and what had been built in the space where the fire was. She knew that was enough. That had always been enough, she thought. The knowing, the doing, the being the person who did the thing rather than the person it was done to. That was what she had taken back when she walked into the Meridian Club on a gray January morning with a document case in her hurt hand and 20 years of being underestimated packed into every page inside it. Not power in the way that room understood power. Something older than that. Something that did not require a room full of men to confirm it. She parked in front of the apartment building. She sat in the car for a moment with the engine off and the radio going quiet and the December air coming through the 2-inch gap, and she was not performing anything for anyone, not managing anything for anyone, not arranging her face for any particular purpose. She was just a woman sitting in her car at the end of a day, tired in the ordinary way of someone who has worked, present in the ordinary way of someone who has somewhere to be that is genuinely theirs. She got out of the car. She went inside. She made dinner for one and ate it at the kitchen table by the window, and the city lights came on outside as the dark came down, and she watched them the way you watch familiar things, without needing them to be more than they were, without asking them to mean anything beyond their own ordinary fact. The lights came on.